Hey there, tonight we're diving into the golden age of radio in 1938, where behind the soothing crackle of the airwaves lies a world of fierce competition and clandestine innovation you never knew existed. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. The year is 1938, and if you're not huddled around a radio in your living room, frankly, you're missing out on the Netflix of the era. No, seriously, these devices were the crown jewels of home entertainment. Radios were to the 1930s what smartphones are today, absolutely indispensable and just a tad addictive. Back then, your household likely had a radio set that cost anywhere from $20 for a basic model to a swanky $200 for a top-of-the-line console, equivalent to a couple of weeks' wages for the average Joe or Jane, mind you. But oh, the magic it brought to your living room, turning it into a theater where the stage was sound and the actors were voices traveling through the airwaves. This technological marvel was transforming American homes faster than you could say, tune in. Nearly 80% of households owned at least one radio, making it the ultimate status symbol, not unlike today's race for the latest iPhone. Families gathered around these audio portals for everything from news broadcasts to heart-pounding dramas. And let's not forget the comedy shows, where jokes were as fast and furious as a modern-day Twitter thread, only with fewer trolls. Economically speaking, radio was a goldmine, raking in $140 million in advertising revenue by the end of the decade. That's about $6 billion today. Yes, with a B. Advertisers realized that radio was not just a platform, but a megaphone, reaching millions with the seductive whisper of jingles and slogans. It was the original influencer marketing, long before anyone ever liked a post or swiped right. Stations like NBC and CBS were the giants of the airwaves, wielding their influence with the kind of power that would make any social media mogul green with envy. These broadcasters were the tastemakers of the day, deciding which voices would be heard and which stories would be told. In a sense, they were the gatekeepers of public discourse, much like the algorithm curators we love to hate today. Radio wasn't just a novelty, it was a cultural shift. It democratized entertainment, bringing it into the homes of the masses, not just the elite. It was the great equalizer, where a coal miner in Pennsylvania could listen to the same opera broadcast as a banker in New York City. And yet, it wasn't all highbrow fare. The most popular broadcasts were often the simplest, the kind that brought families together, like the Lone Ranger galloping across the airwaves or the gut-busting antics of Amos and Andy. Of course, the romantic notion of families gathered round the radio, hanging on every word, glosses over a few inconvenient truths, like the fact that some shows perpetuated stereotypes that were as outdated as a dial-up modem, or that radio, just like any other medium, was susceptible to propaganda and fake news, long before those terms became part of our daily lexicon. Then there's the tale of Orson Welles' infamous War of the Worlds broadcast, which supposedly sparked mass hysteria. The story goes that people ran screaming into the streets, convinced that Martians were invading. In reality, the panic was more of a media frenzy than a public one. Most listeners were savvy enough to realize it was fiction. But hey, never let facts get in the way of a good story, right? The truth is, radio was as much about selling dreams as it was about selling soap. It was a platform that could elevate a nobody to stardom overnight, provided they had the right voice and a bit of luck. The most successful radio personalities were the ones who could paint pictures with words, conjuring entire worlds in the listener's imagination. It's no wonder that when television eventually arrived, many of these voices became faces, transitioning from the airwaves to the silver screen. In 1938, radio was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a member of the family. It was the storyteller, the entertainer, and the news anchor rolled into one. It piped the world into your living room, one crackling broadcast at a time. And while today we might chuckle at the idea of gathering around a box to listen, there's no denying the profound impact these broadcasts had on the culture and commerce of the time. So next time you're streaming your favorite podcast, spare a thought for those early radio pioneers who laid the groundwork for the oral adventures we enjoy today. So, as we tune back into 1938 radio landscape, let's not forget what a kaleidoscope of sound it truly was. Imagine a world where your favorite stories weren't just read, but delivered with the kind of dramatic flair that could turn even the dullest day into an adventure. The radio dial was your portal to soap operas that dripped with melodrama, mysteries so thrilling they could make a detective blush, and comedies sharp enough to slice through the Great Depression gloom. First on the docket, soap operas. Now, these weren't your mother's soap operas, unless, of course, your mother was alive in the 1930s, in which case they probably were. These shows were the emotional lifeblood of many households, tuning in daily to hear the latest trials and tribulations of fictional families. Programs like The Guiding Light and Ma Perkins were the heavy hitters, with millions of listeners hanging on every melodramatic twist and turn. And let's talk numbers. The Guiding Light alone had a run that lasted 72 years, making it one of the longest-running soap operas of all time. That's more endurance than some political dynasties, folks. Mystery shows were another staple, and none was more iconic than The Shadow. With its eerie catchphrase, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows." It captured the imaginations of listeners across the nation. Imagine tuning in and hearing Orson Welles, whose voice could melt butter or freeze your spine, depending on the script. The show blended intrigue with a touch of the supernatural, all wrapped up in a cloak of suspense that left listeners guessing. And it wasn't just a niche pastime. The Shadow drew in millions of eager ears every week. Speaking of mass appeal, let's not ignore Amos and Andy, a comedy series that, for all its controversy, was an absolute ratings juggernaut. At its peak, it snagged a whopping 40 million listeners, roughly a third of the U.S. population at the time. That's like having a podcast today with over 100 million downloads per episode. The show was a cultural phenomenon, but it also perpetuated stereotypes that are as uncomfortable now as a pair of itchy wool socks. Yet, it's a prime example of how radio could elevate voices to household names, even if those voices were never seen. Now, while we're on the subject of voices, it's worth noting how radio stars became celebrities without ever showing their faces. Actors like Agnes Moorehead and Lionel Barrymore were known more for their vocal prowess than their physical appearance. Moorehead, especially with her versatile range, could portray anything from a doting mother to a scheming villain. And Barrymore, his gravelly voice was as distinctive as a fingerprint, instantly recognizable to millions. But radio wasn't all suspense and soap. It was also sprinkled with the saccharine sweetness of sanitized narratives. Advertisers had a knack for painting a rosy picture of American life, where every problem could be solved with the right brand of soap or a particular brand of cigarettes. Commercials were crafted to soothe and sell, weaving a narrative of domestic bliss that glossed over the gritty realities of the day. The ever-present static that accompanied broadcasts was a reminder that, like life, radio was a bit rough around the edges. Rather than a flaw, it was a feature, a quirky little imperfection that made the experience all the more authentic. And what about the listeners themselves? Picture families gathered around the radio, the glow of the dial casting a warm, intimate light in darkened living rooms. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide, as they listened to tales of heroes and villains. Parents, meanwhile, might have been more concerned with the latest news bulletin, each crackling update shaping their understanding of a world in flux. Radio was an auditory tapestry, with each program a thread that wove into the larger fabric of everyday life. Yet this tapestry was often woven with a selective memory. Advertisers and broadcasters alike were adept at crafting narratives that sometimes bore more resemblance to fairy tales than reality. They sold dreams and distractions, and in doing so, created an idealized version of America that was as much fantasy as fact. The sanitized narratives offered a comforting escape, even as they glossed over the complexities and contradictions of the times. In the end, radio was the ultimate paradox, a medium that was both intimate and expansive, personal and public, real and imagined. It was a place where voices could transcend physical space, where sound could paint pictures in the mind's eye, and where the boundary between reality and fiction was often as thin as a whisper. As we delve deeper into this golden era, remember that radio was more than just a series of broadcasts. It was a cultural phenomenon that reshaped how people connected with the world and each other, one crackling transmission at a time. And as much as we might romanticize those days of yore, let's not forget the reality beneath the nostalgia. The airwaves were a battleground for cultural narratives, a platform where the American dream was both celebrated and contested. So, as we continue our exploration, let's keep our ears tuned and our minds open, ready to uncover the stories that shaped an era and the echoes that still resonate today. The airwaves, a battleground of narratives where truth and fiction waged war, each vying for the listener's ear. And in this arena, few wielded radio's power as masterfully as Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR was the original podcast host, long before anyone ever thought of a microphone as a direct line to the electorate. His fireside chats were more than just speeches. They were intimate conversations with the American public, wrapping complex policy debates in the cozy language of a neighborly catch-up. Roosevelt delivered 30 of these chats between 1933 and 1944, reaching an audience of up to 60 million, about half the U.S. population at the time. That's like if every other person in America tuned in to hear you ramble on about your weekend plans. These broadcasts weren't just about soothing the nation during the Great Depression and World War II. They were a masterclass in political communication, a deft blend of reassurance and persuasion. FDR spoke in a way that made listeners feel like they had a personal stake in the nation's recovery. He was the political equivalent of a warm blanket on a cold night. Yet, the appeal of the fireside chats wasn't just FDR's folksy tone or his ability to simplify complex issues. It was the sheer novelty of hearing the president's voice in your living room. Before radio, presidents were distant figures, their words filtered through newspapers or interpreted by trusted community leaders. But with radio, it was as if FDR was talking directly to you, with all the intimacy of a quiet evening by the fireplace. This was a radical shift in how leaders engaged with the public, democratizing political discourse with a personal touch that was previously unimaginable. Of course, Roosevelt's chats weren't all soothing balm. They were strategic, too. Each broadcast was meticulously crafted to rally public support for his New Deal policies or to bolster morale during wartime. And while he was speaking as a friend, there was no mistaking the underlying authority. FDR's voice carried the weight of the presidency, a reminder that even in the most comforting of chats, power was never far from the surface. Now, let's switch gears from political reassurance to full-blown panic, a case study in how radio's power could go spectacularly awry. Enter Orson Welles and his notorious War of the Worlds, broadcast on October 30, 1938. This wasn't just radio, this was theater. A Martian invasion drama presented as a series of news bulletins that sounded so real, it supposedly sent the nation into a frenzy. The legend goes that Americans, believing the planet was under attack, fled their homes, clogged the highways, and dialed the police in a state of hysteria. Newspapers the next day screamed headlines like radio listeners in panic, taking war drama as fact, as if the streets had been overrun with terrified citizens. But here's the kicker. Much of this mass hysteria was, to put it bluntly, a giant wad of exaggeration. Yes, there were some genuine moments of panic. Police records and first-hand accounts confirm that a few listeners did call their local stations or the authorities. But the widespread chaos was largely a media creation, a narrative neatly tied up with a bow and sold to an eager public. After all, why let the truth ruin a perfectly good story? The reality was that most listeners either missed the broadcast's opening disclaimer, where it was clearly stated as fiction, or simply switched the dial when they realized it wasn't real news. Welles himself was as surprised as anyone by the reaction, and the ensuing media storm turned the broadcast into a cultural touchstone. The incident became a cautionary tale about the power of media to shape perception, a lesson as relevant today as it was back then. In the end, War of the Worlds didn't just highlight radio's capacity for mass communication. It underscored its potential for mass miscommunication too. This duality of radio, as both a tool for connection and a vector for confusion, was emblematic of its time. It was a medium that could unite a nation under a single voice or scatter it under the echo of a misunderstood one. And as we continue to explore this golden age, remember that radio was more than just a technological marvel. It was a mirror reflecting the hopes, fears, and sometimes the sheer gullibility of its audience, one broadcast at a time. So, as we inch closer to unraveling more of 1938 radio tapestry, keep your ears perked and your skepticism sharp. Because in the world of radio, the line between reality and imagination was often as thin as the crackling static that accompanied each transmission. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of radio's golden glow, because lurking beneath those crackling broadcasts was a murkier world of censorship, government oversight, and propaganda that could make even the most laissez-faire listener twitch in their armchair. Enter the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, the Airwave's very own hall monitor, formed in 1934. This regulatory body was tasked with keeping the radio landscape as clean as a whistle, but also made sure it wasn't blowing tunes that could cause a national scandal or, heaven forbid, encourage people to think too freely. Picture this, a time when the FCC was the gatekeeper of decency, a term so subjective it could include anything from censoring curse words to reining in political dissent. They were the ones with the red pen, ready to strike through anything that didn't fit into their vision of what was appropriate, or, more importantly, what was beneficial for the nation as it teetered on the brink of World War II. The FCC's role was crucial yet controversial, a balancing act between allowing creative expression and maintaining a firm grip on what could be broadcast to millions of eager ears. Now, don't get me wrong, some regulation was necessary. I mean, without it, the airwaves could have turned into a free-for-all of misinformation, much like, well, parts of the internet today. But the FCC's reach often extended into the realm of creative control. Take Mee West's infamous 1937 performance on The Chase and Sanborn Hour, where her sultry humor ruffled more than a few feathers. The skit led to NBC implementing a ban on West, effectively erasing her iconic voice from the airwaves. It was a stark reminder that radio, while a bastion of creativity, was also a domain tightly controlled by those who held the power to switch the dial from daring to dull. The FCC wasn't just about keeping things PG. With the rise of fascism in Europe and the drumbeats of war growing louder, the Commission had another task: to prevent American airwaves from becoming a megaphone for foreign propaganda. They were the original fact-checkers, albeit with a heavy hand. They clamped down on broadcasts that could be seen as sympathetic to enemy powers or that threatened the burgeoning sense of American unity. It was a time when the airwaves were as much a battlefield as any front line, where words could be weapons, and the FCC was determined to keep the arsenal tightly controlled. But here's the kicker. The very act of censorship often created more buzz than the content being censored, a classic Streisand effect before it even had a name. When Father Charles Coughlin, the so-called radio priest, started spewing anti-Semitic rhetoric on his popular show, the backlash was swift. His broadcasts, which once reached millions, were gradually restricted by wary networks and eventually curtailed by government pressure. Yet, the attempt to silence Coughlin only heightened his infamy, turning a preacher into a pariah with an underground following. Let's not forget about the propaganda machine, the less savory side of radio that turned the airwaves into a tool for shaping public opinion. During the pre-WW2 years, radio was an ideal medium for the government to rally support for its policies and prepare the nation for the possibility of war. The Office of War Information would later capitalize on this, using radio to disseminate pro-American messages and boost morale. But in 1938, this was still a battleground, with various interest groups jockeying to control the narrative. Case in point, the Munich Agreement, when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously declared peace for our time after his meeting with Hitler. The radio networks scrambled to broadcast the news. American listeners were bombarded with updates and analyses, often biased by the network's own political leanings. The result was a cacophony of opinions that left many listeners more confused than informed, a testament to the power and peril of radio as a tool for news. And while we're myth-busting, let's talk about the supposed purity of radio content. Sure, it was sanitized for decency, But that didn't mean it was free of subtext. Censorship often led to more creative innuendo, with writers and performers skirting the rules through clever wordplay that could slip past the censors while still delivering a wink to the audience. It was a dance of language that required as much skill as any Broadway choreography. In this environment, the clash between creative freedom and government control was inevitable. Artists pushed boundaries with the kind of rebellious spirit that artists are known for, while the FCC and station owners pushed back with the equally predictable vigor of those tasked with maintaining order. It was a tug-of-war that played out over the airwaves, where the stakes were the hearts and minds of the American public. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. The reality was that radio was a business, and businesses don't run on ideals alone. Networks like NBC and CBS had to tread carefully, balancing the demands of advertisers, regulators, their own bottom lines. After all, radio wasn't just about entertaining the masses. It was about selling soap, cigarettes, and the American dream, one commercial at a time. The FCC's role was to ensure that this dream wasn't tainted by too much reality. As we delve deeper into the complex web of radio's golden age, remember that behind every broadcast was a team of writers, producers, and executives navigating the choppy waters of creativity, commerce, and control. This was a time when the boundaries of what could be said, and more importantly, what should be said, were constantly being tested. The result was a medium that was as much about what wasn't said as what was, a symphony of silence punctuated by the occasional, rebellious note. So, as we inch closer to the final chapter of our 1938 radio saga, keep this in mind. The airwaves were more than just a means of entertainment or information. They were a reflection of a society grappling with its own identity, a nation on the cusp of change, where every broadcast was a moment of connection and contention. As we continue our journey, remember that radio was not just a relic of the past, but a harbinger of the media landscape we navigate today, with all its complexities, contradictions, and yes, its occasional cacophony. And here we are, standing on the precipice of radio's grand finale, pondering its legacy and wondering whether we've really come all that far in the world of media. You see, radio wasn't just a box of static and sound. It was a revolution in a wooden cabinet. It didn't just change how we consumed media. It completely redefined the very fabric of entertainment and information. The legacy of radio is like a lingering melody, echoing through the annals of time, and it paved the way for the modern media landscape we navigate today. Let's start with the basics. By the end of the 1930s, radio was reaching into 80% of American homes, which meant that it wasn't just a household fixture. It was the household itself, humming with news, drama, and the occasional alien invasion. This widespread adoption laid the groundwork for the mass media we know today, where a single message can reach millions with the flick of a switch, or in today's terms, a tap on a screen. Radio taught us the art of storytelling without visuals, a skill that has been passed down to podcasts and audiobooks, now the darlings of our digital age. Now, if you think the internet invented the idea of going viral, think again. Radio was the original viral platform. Just like memes spread like wildfire today, a hit radio show could become a national sensation overnight. Take The Shadow, for example, which captivated millions with its suspenseful narratives, a testament to radio's power to create cultural phenomena that transcend state lines and socio-economic divides. It was the 1930s version of binge-watching, only you couldn't skip the commercials, which were as much a part of the experience as the show itself. Speaking of commercials, radio was the birthplace of modern advertising. Remember that $140 million in advertising revenue by the decade's end. That's about $2. $6 billion in today's money, and it wasn't earned by accident. Advertisers quickly figured out that radio was more than just a platform. It was a direct line into the listener's subconscious, a way to weave products into the very fabric of everyday life. It was the dawn of influencer marketing, long before an influencer was anything more than a person with a persuasive voice and a well-timed jingle. But let's not gloss over the darker side of this rosy narrative. Radio, much like its digital descendants, was a double-edged sword. It was a tool for enlightenment, but also a vehicle for misinformation. The War of the Worlds broadcast showed us just how easily a well-crafted story could blur the lines between reality and fiction. Fast forward to today, and we're still grappling with the same issues. Only now it's not Martians causing panic, but viral fake news stories and deepfakes. Then there's the communal aspect of radio, something that's largely been lost in our on-demand culture. Back in 1938, families would gather around the radio, sharing in the experience of a broadcast, their imaginations painting pictures more vivid than any screen could display. It was a collective experience, a shared moment in time that brought people together. Today, we've traded that communal experience for convenience, with media consumption often a solitary activity designed to fit our individual schedules and tastes. So, have we evolved, or have we just swapped one medium for another? In many ways, the answer is both. We've gained the ability to curate our own media landscapes, picking and choosing content that fits our personal narratives. But in doing so, we've lost the shared moments that once defined our cultural identity. The radio era was a time when listening was an event, a social gathering, and a shared experience. Now, we listen alone, earbuds in, each of us in our own little world. Yet, despite these changes, the essence of radio echoes through our modern media. The way we consume podcasts, the way we stream music, even the way we engage with social media, all have roots in those early days of radio. It taught us the power of voice, the art of storytelling, and the impact of a well-timed pause. It was the blueprint for the media empires of today, a testament to the timeless nature of a good story well told. In the end, radio was more than just a medium. It was a mirror reflecting the aspirations and anxieties of its time. It was a conduit for connection, a platform for persuasion, and a theater of the mind that sparked the imaginations of millions. As we wrap up our journey through the golden age of radio, let's remember that while the technology may have changed, the core of what we seek from media remains the same. Stories that resonate, voices that connect, and a shared experience that, even for a moment, brings us together in a world that's often all too fragmented. So next time you find yourself tuning into your favorite podcast or streaming the latest hit song, spare a thought for those early pioneers of the airwaves. They may not have had the technology we have today, but they laid the foundation for the rich tapestry of sound that fills our lives. In their crackling broadcasts, they captured the spirit of an era, and in doing so, they left a legacy that continues to echo into the future. In the barren expanse of the Paracas Peninsula, where the desert meets the sea, a story unfolds that's as dry as the landscape itself. But don't let that fool you. This is a tale rich with intrigue, innovation, and the kind of practical genius that makes you wonder if the Paracas were secretly time-traveling engineers. Around 800 BCE, when the Greeks were busy trying to figure out democracy, and the Chinese were just getting their Great Wall party started, the Paracas people were crafting a civilization that was both ahead of its time and perfectly suited to its environment. The Paracas Peninsula and the nearby Nazca Desert were not just random coordinates on a map. They were prime real estate for a civilization looking to thrive in a hostile climate. The peninsula juts out into the Pacific Ocean like a giant thumb, with the desert spreading inland, creating a unique blend of maritime and arid ecosystems. This location was a jackpot for trade and agriculture if you knew how to play your cards right. Spoiler alert, the Paracas did. They turned these geographical quirks into a thriving hub. Now, you might have heard whispers of the Paracas as some sort of ancient super society with mystical knowledge. Cue the History Channel voiceover and ominous music. But let's slam the brakes on that rumor train. While they were indeed advanced, their genius wasn't in making contact with extraterrestrials or building portals to other dimensions. It was in their practical, no-nonsense approach to life. Think of them more as ancient MacGyvers, turning sand and sea into a sustainable lifestyle. Trade was the lifeblood of the Paracas society, and they were perfectly positioned to be the middlemen of the ancient world. Their proximity to both the coast and the interior meant they could swap goods with highland farmers, coastal fishermen, and even distant cultures. This wasn't just about getting the best deals on llama wool or fish. It was about survival and prosperity in a tough environment. Their trade networks stretched over hundreds of miles, a remarkable feat without the luxury of Amazon Prime. In terms of agriculture, the Paracas were no slouches either. They figured out how to coax crops from the desert sands by channeling scarce water resources with a network of aqueducts and wells. These weren't your average backyard sprinklers. We're talking serious engineering. The irrigation systems they developed allowed them to cultivate cotton, maize, and other staples, supporting a growing population. It was a case of making the desert bloom long before Las Vegas turned it into an art form. But let's not get too romantic. For all their ingenuity, the Paracas were still very much a product of their time. Their society was hierarchical, with power concentrated in the hands of a few. Archaeological finds suggest they were a theocratic oligarchy, where religious and political leaders held sway over the masses. So, while they were building aqueducts and trading fine textiles, they were also reinforcing social structures that kept the elite in power. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And about those myths of the Paracas being advanced. Sure, they had their moments of brilliance, but let's keep things in perspective. Their architecture, while impressive, wasn't exactly the stuff of sci-fi dreams. They didn't construct towering ziggurats or sprawling palaces. Instead, they focused on what worked: efficient, practical structures made from local materials. Their use of adobe and stone was less about creating monumental wonders and more about surviving the elements. It was a case of function over form, with a dash of style. Their approach to construction and resource management was a testament to their adaptability. The Paracas weren't trying to impress future archaeologists. They were just trying to make it through another harvest. And yet, in their pragmatism, they laid the groundwork for future civilizations, influencing cultures like the Nazca, who would go on to draw those famous lines in the sand. So, as we unravel the mysteries of the Paracas, let's appreciate them for what they were: a society that thrived through clever innovation and practical know-how. They weren't building rocket ships, but they were building a world that made sense. And in the grand tapestry of history, that's no small feat. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the fascinating world of the Paracas, where there's always more than meets the eye and a good bit of sand in your shoes. With sand still clinging to their sandals, the Paracas weren't just dreamers of an agrarian utopia. They were the gritty, hands-on engineers of their time, wielding shovels like magic wands. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty of their underground aqueducts, which were less about conjuring water out of thin air and more about bending the desert to their will. Picture this: a network of subterranean channels stretching like the veins of the earth, pumping life into the parched landscape. These weren't just any ditches. Oh no, they were sophisticated, gravity-defying feats of engineering that would make even modern-day civil engineers raise an eyebrow. Now, let's talk specifics. The Paracas employed a technique called puquios, which involved digging deep, spiraling channels into the ground to tap into underground water reserves. We're talking about channels that could reach depths of over 20 meters, around 65 feet for those of you who measure things in football fields. These spiral-shaped shafts, akin to nature's own Plinko machine, funneled water from the aquifers to the surface with a gentle gradient, allowing gravity to do the heavy lifting. No mystical water dances required, just good old-fashioned physics. In a region that averages just a few inches of rain annually, these aqueducts were nothing short of a desert miracle. But before we start attributing magical abilities to the Paracas, let's set the record straight. It wasn't divine intervention or alien technology that made these aqueducts possible. It was sheer human ingenuity. The Paracas understood the lay of the land and how to exploit it, turning the unforgiving desert terrain into a wellspring of agriculture. They were like the original desert whisperers, coaxing crops from the soil with a mix of intuition and hard-won knowledge. The construction of these aqueducts wasn't just about digging holes and hoping for the best. The Paracas had a knack for marrying form and function. They lined their channels with stone and adobe, materials readily available in their environment, ensuring durability and longevity. These materials weren't chosen for their aesthetic appeal. There were no Instagrammable moments here, but for their practicality and sustainability. They knew their aqueducts had to withstand both the test of time and the occasional earthquake, which was as much a part of life in this region as sand in your shoes. And let's not forget the economic implications of this hydraulic mastery. With a reliable water source, the Paracas could grow more than just cacti. Cotton, maize, and beans flourished under their careful watch, turning the desert into a veritable oasis. This agricultural bounty wasn't just for feasting. It was currency in the trade network the Paracas had so cleverly woven. Water wasn't just life, it was wealth, and the Paracas knew how to bank it. As for the myth of the Paracas as mystical water conjurers, it's easy to see why it took hold. After all, the desert can seem otherworldly, a place where survival itself feels like an act of magic. But strip away the allure of the mystical, and what you're left with is something even more impressive. A culture that understood the science behind their environment and harnessed it for their survival. They didn't need to summon rain from the heavens when they could summon water from the earth with a well-placed tunnel and a bit of know-how. Their achievements remind us that often the true magic lies in the mundane details of hard work and clever problem-solving. The Paracas weren't performing miracles. They were performing the ancient art of not dying in the desert. And if that's not a feat worth celebrating, I don't know what is. So, as we pore over the ruins of their aqueducts, we're not just looking at ancient irrigation systems. We're looking at a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. In a world where nature often holds all the cards, the Paracas managed to stack the deck in their favor. They turned scarcity into surplus, and in doing so, carved out a legacy that still flows beneath the sands of time. As we continue to trace the winding paths of their water channels, let's keep in mind that the real story here isn't one of mysticism, but of mastery over the elements, a story that echoes through the ages, reminding us of the power of human innovation even in the most inhospitable of climates. As we leave behind the ingenuity of Paracas aqueducts, we tumble headlong into the sandy embrace of their necropolis, a sprawling city of the dead that reveals the living's most intimate secrets. Think of it as the ultimate Paracas time capsule, albeit one wrapped in layers of textiles so intricate they'd make a fashionista weep with envy. The Paracas necropolis is a testament to their complex social and religious systems, but it's also a place where the lines between spirituality and politics blur like a watercolor painting in the rain. Now, let's talk about these famous mummy bundles. Forget your typical mummy wrapped in a neat little bow. The Paracas took burial practices to a whole new level, swaddling their deceased in layers upon layers of elaborate textiles. We're talking about upwards of 300 individual pieces of fabric for a single body. That's not just a burial, it's a fashion statement. These textiles were more than mere shrouds. They were status symbols, each layer a testament to the deceased's social standing and wealth. The Paracas weren't just wrapping up their dead like ancient burritos for the afterlife. No, this was a full-blown textile extravaganza. These fabrics were adorned with intricate designs, vibrant colors, and patterns so detailed you'd think they had an entire sweatshop dedicated to afterlife couture. And maybe they did, in a manner of speaking. Creating these textiles required a level of skill and artistry that was nothing short of astonishing. Some of the threads were as fine as 200 per inch. To put that into perspective, you'd need a magnifying glass and the patience of a saint to achieve such precision. But before we get swept away by the romantic notion of Paracas as benevolent weavers of the afterlife, let's take a step back. These mummy bundles weren't just about ensuring a cozy eternal rest. They were also about power, specifically who wielded it. In a society where the elite held sway, these textiles were a way to reinforce social hierarchies, even in death. The more elaborate the wrapping, the more important the person. It's like a morbid version of Keeping Up with the Joneses, except the Joneses are 6 feet under and wrapped in 300 layers of artisanal fabric. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the sheer economic effort these textiles represented. The labor and resources involved in producing such elaborate burial garments were enormous. This wasn't a simple case of sewing a few sheets together. The dye needed for those vibrant hues, imported from far-off lands, the time and skill required to produce them, borderline Herculean. So, while these mummy bundles are undoubtedly a marvel, they're also a reminder of the socio-political power plays at work beneath the fabric. And here's where the myth-busting comes in. It's easy to view these burials through a purely spiritual lens, imagining the Paracas as a people deeply invested in the journey to the afterlife. But the reality is that these burials were as much about reinforcing earthly hierarchies as they were about spiritual beliefs. The necropolis wasn't just a resting place. It was a silent testament to the power dynamics of Paracas society, a place where the living cemented their status through the dead. In fact, the very act of burying the dead in such a manner was a political statement. It was a way for the elite to assert their dominance, even from beyond the grave. The more opulent the burial, the more it signaled the deceased's influence and, by extension, the family's ongoing power. It's the ultimate posthumous flex, a way of saying, "Look at me and remember my greatness," long after the sands of time have covered their tracks. So, as we unravel the layers of the Paracas mummy bundles, we're not just looking at an ancient burial practice. We're peeling back the layers of a society that understood the power of symbolism and used it to maintain control. It's a reminder that even in death, politics and power are never far behind, lurking beneath the surface like a ghostly puppet master pulling the strings. Yet, within this tapestry of power and status, there's a fascinating glimpse into the Paracas worldview. The motifs and designs woven into the textiles often featured animals, plants, and figures from mythology, showcasing their beliefs and values. These were not random doodles, but carefully chosen symbols that conveyed messages about the deceased's life or the society they left behind. It's like reading a biography, except the pages are made of cloth, and the words are woven into the very fabric of history. But let's not get too sentimental. For all the beauty and craftsmanship on display, these burial practices were also a stark reflection of the societal inequalities that permeated the Paracas culture. The grandeur of a mummy bundle was directly proportional to the wealth and status of the individual, leaving little room for the ordinary folk who likely received far more modest burials. This wasn't the egalitarian utopia of the afterlife. It was a continuation of the earthly social order, dressed up in layers of finery. As we stand amidst the remains of the Paracas necropolis, it's tempting to romanticize these ancient burials as expressions of a deeply spiritual culture. And while there's truth to that, there's also a more pragmatic reality at play. The Paracas were not just burying their dead. They were making statements about power, control, and the social fabric of their world. It's a reminder that history is rarely as clear-cut as it seems, and beneath every romanticized narrative lies a web of complexity that defies easy categorization. So, as we leave the necropolis and its silent stories behind, let's carry with us the knowledge that the Paracas were masters of more than just the loom. They understood the intricate dance of power and symbolism, weaving it into every aspect of their lives, and ultimately their afterlives. In doing so, left us a legacy that's as colorful and complex as the textiles that shroud their enduring mysteries. And as we continue to unravel the threads of their history, let's keep an eye out for the truths hidden beneath the layers, where the past whispers its secrets to those willing to listen. Just as we've been peeling back the layers of Paracas society through their mummy bundles, let's now spin the wheel of history back to the living, where the Paracas really flexed their creative muscles. Textiles, and boy, did they know how to wield a loom. We're not talking about your grandma's knitting here. We're talking about some of the most exquisite fabrics ever to grace the sands of time. Imagine textiles so detailed they'd make a Renaissance painter break a sweat, and colors so vibrant they'd put a modern-day color wheel to shame. Now, let's address the elephant, or should I say, the alpaca, in the room. These textiles weren't spun from the everyday sheep's wool you might expect. The Paracas used alpaca wool, a material that's softer than a whisper and warmer than a sweltering summer day in the desert. Alpacas, those fluffy, long-necked wonders, were like the cashmere goats of the Andes. Their wool was the fabric of choice for the Paracas, and it wasn't just for comfort. It was a status symbol, a way to say, "I've got the good stuff." But before you start picturing these textiles as mere decorative pieces, let's unravel another thread of their story. Sure, they were beautiful. They were also loaded with meaning. Think of them as wearable novels, each thread a line of the story. The iconography woven into these fabrics was more detailed than a soap opera plot, featuring everything from mythical creatures to geometric patterns that would make Pythagoras proud. These designs weren't just pretty pictures. They were cultural narratives, visual storytelling at its finest. Each piece was a tapestry of tales, woven with the skill of a master storyteller. And here's where we take a swift detour from the romanticized idea that these textiles were just fancy drapes to impress the neighbors. In reality, they were as much about social standing as they were about aesthetics. They were the ancient equivalent of a Rolex or a designer handbag, a statement of wealth and power. When someone strutted around in a particularly intricate textile, they weren't just making a fashion statement. They were broadcasting their social status, loud and clear. In a society where the elite called the shots, The fabric you wore could speak volumes about your place in the social hierarchy. So, let's get into the nitty-gritty of what made these textiles so jaw-dropping. First off, the colors. We're talking about reds, blues, and yellows so vivid, they seem to defy the passage of time. The Paracas achieved these colors using natural dyes, sourced from every corner of their trade network. Cochineal insects for red, indigo plants for blue, and a whole palette of other natural ingredients mixed with the precision of a master chef. This was an era when color wasn't just clicked on a digital palette. It was painstakingly extracted and applied, a process as rich as the hues it produced. But let's not forget about the iconography itself. These weren't random doodles. They were carefully chosen motifs that conveyed specific messages. You might see a jaguar, symbolizing power and protection, or a double-headed serpent, representing the duality of life. These symbols weren't just decorative. They were a language, a way for the Paracas to communicate complex ideas without uttering a single word. It's like emoji, but way more sophisticated, and without the risk of sending the wrong message with a rogue eggplant. Now, here's the kicker. These textiles weren't just for the living. The same meticulous care was extended to the dead, wrapped in layers and layers of these exquisite fabrics. And while we've talked about the mummy bundles as status symbols, they were also a continuation of storytelling beyond the grave. The textiles draping the deceased were like a final chapter, a closing statement that encapsulated the life, beliefs, and achievements of the individual. It's as if the Paracas found a way to weave immortality into their threads, leaving behind a legacy that would outlast even the most durable of monuments. When we talk about the Paracas textiles, it's easy to get swept away by their beauty and craftsmanship. But let's not lose sight of the socio-economic undercurrents that ran through every stitch. These textiles were a significant part of the Paracas economy, a commodity as valuable as gold. Producing them required a network of skilled artisans, each contributing to a complex production process that was both time-consuming and labor-intensive. This wasn't just art for art's sake. It was a vital industry, a cornerstone of the Paracas economy that fueled trade and reinforced social structures. And here's where we bust another myth. The idea that the Paracas were simply master weavers living in a harmonious textile utopia. The reality was more cutthroat. The creation of these textiles was a labor of love, sure, but it was also a means of survival in a society where social standing dictated everything from what you wore to how you were remembered. It was a world where the loom was both a tool and a weapon, wielded to maintain power and prestige. So, as we stand back and admire the intricate patterns and vibrant colors of Paracas textiles, let's remember that they were more than just decorative pieces. They were the threads that wove together the fabric of Paracas society, a complex tapestry of art, economy, and power. And while the romantic allure of these ancient fabrics is undeniable, the reality beneath the surface is a stark reminder of the socio-political forces that shaped the world of the Paracas. As we continue to unravel the secrets of this fascinating culture, let's keep our eyes peeled for the stories hidden within the threads, where the artistry of the Paracas speaks volumes about their ingenuity and resilience. In every woven line, we find not just the handiwork of skilled artisans, but the echoes of a society that understood the power of storytelling, even when the words were spun from alpaca wool. And as we move forward in our historical journey, let's carry with us the knowledge that the Paracas, with their textiles, left a legacy that's as colorful and complex as the history they helped weave. And speaking of weaving a legacy, let's unravel the threads of the Paracas' influence on the civilizations that followed, because these folks didn't just pack up their looms and vanish into the desert dust. Oh no, the Paracas were like the original influencers, leaving a mark that echoed across the Andes long after their last alpaca had shed its wool. Contrary to the dramatic tales of their sudden disappearance, cue the eerie music and conspiracy theories, they didn't pull a Houdini act. Instead, they evolved, merged, and left a legacy as enduring as their textiles. Now, let's set the record straight. The Paracas didn't just poof into the pages of history like an ancient Snapchat message. They integrated into the Nazca civilization, which picked up the baton and sprinted with it, creating those mesmerizing geoglyphs that have puzzled us for centuries. Picture the Nazca lines as a giant thank you note etched into the desert, acknowledging the Paracas for their groundwork. The Nazca took the Paracas' knack for harnessing the environment and ran wild, preserving and evolving architectural techniques, trade routes, and social structures. Think of it as a cultural relay race, with the Nazca building on the foundation laid by their predecessors. The influence of the Paracas on subsequent cultures wasn't just limited to the Nazca. Their approach to irrigation, that genius marriage of form and function, trickled down through Andean societies like a river carving its way through rock. The concept of puquios, those spiraling aqueducts, became a blueprint for sustainable agriculture in a region where water was more precious than gold. It's like they left behind a user manual for desert living, one that future generations would tweak but never discard. Economically, the Paracas set a precedent for trade networks that future Andean civilizations would expand upon. Their strategic location as middlemen between coastal and highland regions was a stroke of geographic genius. While the Paracas traded textiles and agricultural goods, the civilizations that followed, like the Wari and later the Inca, would build empires on these very trade routes. The legacy of the Paracas was like an ancient version of a successful startup that others scaled into a multinational corporation. But let's not get misty-eyed with nostalgia just yet. For all their advancements, the Paracas were still rooted in a society where power was concentrated among the elite, and their social hierarchy was as rigid as their textiles were colorful. This structure, too, was passed on to future cultures. The Nazca, and later the Incas, maintained similar hierarchies, where religion and politics were intertwined and often indistinguishable. It was a world where the gods were both spiritual guides and political tools, a tradition that remained as unyielding as the Andean mountains. As we look at the modern world through the lens of Paracas' innovation, it's hard not to draw parallels. Their pragmatic yet inventive spirit resonates today, especially in how we approach sustainable living and resource management. Their understanding of the environment and ability to adapt is a lesson for anyone trying to survive in a world where climate change is as much a reality as the desert was for them. The Paracas didn't see the desert as a barrier, but as a challenge, one they met with creativity and ingenuity. It's a mindset that's as relevant today as it was over 2 millennia ago. Let's talk legacy, and not the kind that's etched in stone or written in history books, but the kind that lives on in ideas and practices. The Paracas culture, with its emphasis on practical solutions and innovation, laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most advanced civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas. Their influence is like a ghostly whisper across the Andes, an echo of resilience and creativity that continues to inspire. In reflecting on the Paracas, it's tempting to get caught up in the romantic notion of an ancient civilization frozen in time, but let's remember that history is a living, breathing entity. The Paracas didn't vanish. They evolved, and in doing so, they ensured their place in the tapestry of Andean history. Their legacy is a testament to the enduring power of human ingenuity, a reminder that even in the harshest environments, creativity and adaptability can carve out a place in history. So, as we wrap up our journey through the sands of time, let's leave with this thought. The Paracas were more than just master weavers and ingenious engineers. They were visionaries who saw beyond the horizon, who understood that the true measure of a civilization isn't in what it leaves behind, but in how it shapes the world that follows. Their story is a reminder that history isn't just about the past. It's about the lasting impact of human innovation, a legacy woven into the very fabric of our world. As we continue to explore the mysteries of ancient civilizations, let's carry with us the knowledge that the Paracas, with their practical genius and indomitable spirit, left us more than just ruins. They left us a blueprint for resilience and creativity that still resonates today. The Iberian Peninsula in the late 16th century was a lot like high school. Spain and Portugal were the popular kids who everyone wanted to befriend, yet these two couldn't have been more different. Spain was the extroverted drama queen, boasting a huge empire that stretched from the Americas to Asia. Portugal, on the other hand, was the introverted overachiever, quietly amassing a global trading network from the coast of Africa to the spice-laden islands of the East Indies. And in 1580, these two frenemies decided to shack up under one crown in what historians call the Iberian Union. That's right. Spain and Portugal were like the Ross and Rachel of the 16th century, minus the coffee shop, and plus a lot more gold. Now, let's rewind a little to 1578. Picture King Sebastian of Portugal, a young monarch with the kind of bravado that only comes from being 24 and convinced of your own invincibility. Hoping to score some eternal glory, he gallivanted off to Morocco to fight in the Battle of Alcácer-Quibir. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well. Sebastian and his army were defeated, and he never returned. It's like a bad episode of a medieval Game of Thrones, without dragons, but definitely with a lot of bloodshed. With Sebastian MIA and presumed dead, Portugal was left in a bit of a pickle. Enter Philip Roman II of Spain, Sebastian's uncle and the closest thing to a dynastic solution. Philip Roman II, who was already juggling more crowns than a medieval jester, saw an opportunity to add another jewel to his royal collection. By 1580, the Iberian Union was born, with Spain and Portugal awkwardly clinking goblets at a metaphorical family dinner table. The union officially kicked off with the courts of Tama in 1581, a sort of medieval business merger meeting where Philip Roman II promised Portuguese nobles that they'd retain their independence and privileges. In return, he got to don the crown of Portugal and pretend this whole thing was harmonious. The reality, more like an awkward Thanksgiving dinner where everyone smiles through gritted teeth while secretly wanting to throw mashed potatoes. But why did this union matter? On paper, it looked like a match made in mercantile heaven. Spain's American silver and gold were supposed to flow seamlessly through Portugal's existing trade routes to Asia and Africa. The potential for global domination was enormous. Yet, like many grand plans, the execution had a few hiccups. For starters, Portugal wasn't thrilled about playing second fiddle. Their trade networks were already thriving, thank you very much, and the last thing they wanted was a Spanish overlord meddling with their affairs. It's like having a roommate who insists on rearranging your furniture without asking. And then there was the rest of Europe, who were about as thrilled about this union as a cat in a bathtub. England, the Netherlands, and France were particularly peeved, seeing this as a threat to their own trade ambitions. They started poking and prodding at the Iberian behemoth, eager to exploit any weaknesses. Think of it as a medieval version of office politics, with everyone trying to undercut each other's trade deals. The Iberian Union was essentially a grandiose attempt at world domination, yet it barely lasted 2 generations. By 1640, the Portuguese had had enough of playing second string and decided to stage a little rebellion known as the Portuguese Restoration War. Spoiler, they won, and by 1668, Spain officially recognized Portugal's independence. The Iberian Union was history, and the two nations went back to being cordial neighbors who occasionally borrowed sugar. In the end, the Iberian Union is a fascinating tale of ambition, politics, and the harsh realities of empire building. It was as much about the lure of gold and spices as it was about the human desire for power and prestige. And while it didn't last, the Union left a lasting impact on global trade, setting the stage for the economic and political dynamics of the modern world. So, here's to Spain and Portugal, proof that even the best-laid plans can go hilariously awry. So, with the Iberian Union in full swing, Spain and Portugal weren't just dreaming of a global trade empire, they were gunning for it like a couple of high-stakes poker players. Their map of ambitions was a kaleidoscope of crisscross trade routes, looking more like a toddler's crayon drawing than a master plan. But hey, who needs neat lines when you've got the allure of spices and gold? Let's dive into the spicy details, literally. The spice routes were the crown jewels of trade, and the Iberian Union wanted to wear that crown with the flair of a peacock at a masquerade ball. Picture this: nutmeg from the Banda Islands, cloves from the Moluccas, and cinnamon from Ceylon. These weren't just kitchen staples. They were the Bitcoin of the 16th century. The profits were jaw-dropping. A single sack of nutmeg could fetch 60,000% profit once it hit European markets. Talk about turning cents into fortunes. But wait, before you start romanticizing this as a seamless operation of global grandeur, let's pump the brakes. The reality wasn't as smooth as a well-aged Rioja. The logistics of managing these trade routes were about as straightforward as a Rubik's Cube in the hands of a toddler. Ships had to traverse vast oceans, battling unpredictable weather, pirates with more attitude than swagger, and supply lines that stretched thinner than a starving artist's wallet. Take Brazil, for example, Portugal's darling in the New World. It was the crown's sugar daddy, quite literally, with sugar plantations that were potential gold mines. By the late 1500, Brazil was producing roughly 30,000 tons of sugar annually. But here's the kicker. Transporting that sugar back to Europe was no cakewalk. Shipping costs were astronomical. It took about 60 to 90 days to sail across the Atlantic, and that's if you were lucky enough to dodge hurricanes and corsairs. The price of sugar in Lisbon was nearly double what it was in Brazil, thanks to these hefty shipping costs. And then there was Goa, the pearl of the Orient, nestled in India. It was supposed to be Portugal's gateway to the East, a bustling hub of trade where spices, cotton, and silk passed like gossip in a small town. Yet, maintaining control over such a prized colony was like trying to hold water in a sieve. The costs were exorbitant. Military garrisons, naval patrols, and fortifications didn't come cheap. Plus, the local rulers weren't exactly thrilled about European overlords, leading to frequent skirmishes that drained resources faster than a leaky bucket. The Philippines, on the other hand, was Spain's playground in Asia. Manila became a vibrant trade center where Chinese silks met Mexican silver, creating the kind of economic buzz that would make Wall Street jealous. By 1600, the Manila galleons were the stuff of legend, massive ships that carried goods across the Pacific. But here's the unvarnished truth. These voyages were perilous and costly. Each galleon was a floating treasure trove, but also a prime target for pirates and the elements. The loss of a single ship could mean financial ruin, and despite the grand ambitions, the actual profits were often as elusive as a mirage in the desert. So, while the Iberian Union had its eyes set on global domination, the execution was more akin to a clumsy dance than a well-oiled machine. The myth of seamless control dissolves when you consider the patchwork of challenges, logistics, local resistance, and the sheer unpredictability of maritime trade. It's like trying to build a house of cards in a wind tunnel. And let's not forget the neighbors. Other European powers were watching this elaborate juggling act with the kind of anticipation that a cat watches a mouse, ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness. The English, Dutch, and French were not about to let the Iberian duo hog all the trade routes. They launched their own expeditions, sometimes resorting to good old-fashioned piracy just to get a slice of the pie. The Spanish and Portuguese found themselves constantly defending their territories, a game of geopolitical whack-a-mole that drained both finances and patience. In the end, the Iberian Union's attempt to dominate global trade was a bold gamble, an audacious bid to control the world's spice rack, sugar fields, and silk markets. Yet, for all their grand planning, the execution was fraught with more hurdles than a steeplet chase. It's a tale of ambition meeting reality, where the promise of riches was tempered by the hard-nosed realities of empire building. But don't close the book just yet. There's more to this saga, as the Iberian dream continues to unfurl in unexpected ways. Now, as the Iberian dream spun its complicated web across the globe, the cracks in this ambitious tapestry started to show. It turns out that when Spain and Portugal tried to share the crown, they didn't exactly see eye to eye on who got to wear it more often. Think of it as a royal tug-of-war with a crown that was a tad too big for both heads. For starters, our Portuguese friends weren't exactly sipping caipirinhas on the beach, content with their Spanish brethren calling the shots. Oh no, the Portuguese merchants, those savvy navigators and traders, were miffed. They were used to running their own show, thank you very much, and Spanish oversight felt about as welcome as a rainstorm at a picnic. The merchants were particularly peeved about Spain's meddling in their lucrative spice trade routes. After all, Portugal had spent a century building this empire of spices, only to have Spain waltz in and act like they owned the place. Imagine hosting a party and someone else taking credit for the playlist. And if you think the merchants were grumbling, the military folks weren't exactly singing cumbaya either. Spain's military ambitions were stretching thinner than a hipster's jeans. The Spanish crown, in all its imperial wisdom, decided it was a great idea to deploy its troops across the vast expanse of the empire, from the stormy seas of the Caribbean to the arid deserts of North Africa. By the early 1600, Spain had about 300,000 soldiers scattered across its territories, which sounds impressive until you realize the costs were bleeding the treasury dry. Maintaining such a vast army was like trying to fill a leaky bucket. No matter how much gold you poured in, it never seemed enough. Now, speaking of gold, let's talk numbers. The Spanish crown was forking out around 3 million ducats annually just to keep its military machine whirring. That's roughly $1 billion in today's currency, enough to buy a few islands in the Caribbean or, a small European country. And all this spending was happening while Spanish ships, loaded with American silver, were being hunted down by pirates with more swagger than Blackbeard on a sugar rush. Ah yes, pirates, the rock stars of the high seas. These weren't just any pirates. They were often disgruntled sailors, fed up with the meager pay and harsh conditions of naval life. Many turned piracy into a side gig, raiding the very ships they once served on. It was a vicious cycle. Spain would send silver across the Atlantic, only to see it vanish into the hands of these swashbuckling opportunists. And let's be honest, who could resist the allure of a pirate's life? Sunshine, sea breezes, and treasure chests. It's enough to make anyone rethink their career path. But the real kicker was the constant threat from other European powers. The Dutch, in particular, were not content to sit on the sidelines while Spain and Portugal danced around the globe. They saw the Iberian Union as a bloated giant, ripe for the picking. The Dutch launched their own expeditions, capturing key Portuguese outposts like Malacca and the coveted spice islands of the East Indies. By the early 17th century, the Dutch East India Company was raking in profits that would make a modern hedge fund manager blush. Meanwhile, back in the Iberian Peninsula, the political landscape was as volatile as a soap opera. Spanish administrators, often out of touch with local Portuguese customs and needs, tried to impose their will, and the Portuguese nobility was having none of it. They fought back with a blend of passive resistance and outright defiance, determined to maintain their autonomy. It was like trying to herd cats, frustrating, feudal, and occasionally hilarious to watch. The Iberian Union, once a grand vision of shared prosperity, was beginning to look more like a mismatched marriage, with both sides counting the days until they could file for divorce. The tension was palpable, from the courts of Lisbon to the docks of Goa, and as the decades wore on, the cracks widened into chasms. But don't hang up your spyglass just yet. While the Iberian Union stumbled over its own ambitions, the world around it was changing at breakneck speed. This tale of power and politics is far from over, as new players and unexpected twists continue to unfold on this global stage. So, grab your tricorn hat and buckle up, because the ride is just getting started. As the Iberian Union teetered on its precarious perch, it wasn't just internal squabbles that threatened to topple this grandiose endeavor. Enter the Dutch and the English, the uninvited guests who crashed the party with all the subtlety of a cannonball. These two were the rising stars of the maritime stage, and they were not content playing second fiddle to the Spanish and Portuguese. The Dutch revolt was more than just a spat over taxes and religion. It was the opening salvo in a full-blown economic war. By the 1600, the United Provinces of the Netherlands had transformed from a rebellious backwater into a mercantile juggernaut. Their ships, sleek and nimble, zipped across the seas like caffeinated dolphins, snatching up trade routes and outposts faster than you could say tulip mania. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, was the world's first multinational corporation, and it wasn't shy about using its financial muscle to squeeze the Iberian Union out of lucrative markets. And then there was the English. Under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, England had emerged as a formidable naval power. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was a seismic shift, and though it was more a case of bad weather than English brilliance, it gave the English a confidence boost that was as uplifting as a Shakespearean soliloquy. With their sights set on expanding their own colonial empire, the English established the East India Company in 1600, a direct rival to Iberian interests in Asia. They weren't just after spices and silks. They were gunning for a piece of the global trade pie, and they were willing to play dirty to get it. The Battle of the Downs in 1639 was a perfect illustration of how the Iberian Union's dreams unraveled under external pressure. Picture this. The Spanish fleet, loaded with troops and treasure, was caught with its proverbial pants down by the Dutch Navy in the English Channel, of all places. It was a naval showdown that could have been the climax of a blockbuster movie, complete with cannon fire and strategic maneuvers. The result? A resounding Dutch victory that left Spain licking its wounds and wondering where it all went wrong. The Battle of the Downs wasn't just a military defeat. It was an economic earthquake that shook the foundations of Spanish and Portuguese dominance at sea. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the 30 Years' War, 1618-1648, was wreaking havoc across the continent, draining resources and attention from the Iberian Union's overseas ambitions. Spain, embroiled in this continental quagmire, found its coffers emptier than a pirate's conscience. The war was a vortex of alliances and betrayals, and it was costly, astronomically so. By the mid-17th century, Spain was spending over 9 million ducats annually just to keep its war machine sputtering along. That's enough to make today's military budgets look like a bargain bin at a flea market. As Spain's economy faltered, Portugal's discontent simmered to a boil. The Portuguese nobility, ever the opportunists, seized the moment. In 1640, they staged a coup that was as swift as it was bloodless, declaring independence from their Iberian partners, with a flourish that would make any revolutionary proud. The ensuing Portuguese Restoration War was a David and Goliath story, with Portugal regaining its autonomy after a grueling 28 years of on-and-off conflict. Spain, exhausted from years of warfare and financial strain, finally recognized Portuguese independence in 1668, marking the official end of the Iberian Union. So what was left in the wake of this grand experiment? The Iberian Union, once a beacon of global ambition, was now a cautionary tale of hubris and overreach. It turns out that controlling an empire spanning continents and oceans is a bit trickier than a game of Risk. The Union's downfall wasn't just about external pressures. It was a perfect storm of internal discord, economic mismanagement, and geopolitical competition that turned the dream of a unified Iberian empire into a historical footnote. But let's not write the final chapter just yet. The legacy of the Iberian Union, while tarnished, continued to ripple through the centuries. The impact on global trade, the shifts in power dynamics, and the lessons learned from its grand ambitions are stories that still resonate today. As we leave the Iberian Union behind, remember, history is a tapestry woven from threads of triumph and folly, and the next twist in the tale is always just a page away. The Iberian Union's downfall may have been less a tragic romance and more a cautionary tale about biting off more than you can chew. The grand dreams of a united Iberian empire, with its fingers in every global pie, crumbled as reality came knocking with a hefty bill. And what a bill it was! The promises of seamless riches and shared glory turned into a spaghetti mess of debts, rebellions, and rivalries. Let's start with the aftermath of the divorce in 1640. Picture Portugal, the feisty partner, finally shaking off the shackles of Spanish dominance like a phoenix rising from the ashes, or at least like a cat shaking off a pesky collar. The Portuguese Restoration War was more than just a bid for independence. It was a declaration that they weren't going to be the sidekick in Spain's superhero saga anymore. Those 28 tumultuous years of back-and-forth skirmishes were a testament to Portugal's resilience and Spain's overextension. But what about the long-term impacts on global trade? Here's where the plot thickens. With Portugal reclaiming its autonomy, the global chessboard was reshuffled. Portugal wasted no time in rekindling its trading prowess, particularly in the East Indies. The spice trade, that heady mix of cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon, was more than just a culinary adventure. It was a lifeline for the Portuguese economy. By the late 17th century, Portugal was back in the game, cutting deals that would make a Silicon Valley startup jealous. Meanwhile, Spain, licking its wounds, had to contend with the fact that their empire was a tad too sprawling. The American silver that had once flowed into their coffers like a never-ending river of wealth was now a trickle, thanks to piracy and those pesky Dutch and English rivals. The Spanish treasure fleets, once the stuff of legend, were increasingly becoming the punchline of pirate jokes. By the 1650, Spain's hold on its New World territories was as tenuous as a soap bubble in a hurricane. Now, let's dissect this enduring rivalry between Spain and Portugal. Like two siblings who can't stop comparing report cards, their relationship remained fraught with competition. This rivalry was more than just trade routes and territorial disputes. It was about national identity and prestige. Spain and Portugal found themselves in a constant tug-of-war, their ambitions often clashing on the global stage well into the 18th century. Even as they signed treaties and drew borders, they knew the dance of dominance was far from over. As we reflect on the legacy of the Iberian Union, it's tempting to romanticize it as a grand experiment in empire building. But let's not get carried away. The Union was riddled with more plot holes than a soap opera. Primary sources from the time reveal a story of grand intentions marred by miscommunication and economic strain. Spanish chroniclers like Diego de Saavedra Fajardo wrote about the mutual benefit of the Union, but the reality was often one-sided. Portuguese documents tell a different story, one of frustration and resistance, a desire to break free from the gilded cage of Spanish oversight. So, what lessons did history teach us, if any? For one, the Iberian Union serves as a reminder that bigger isn't always better. Trying to control an empire that spans the globe might sound glamorous, but it's a logistical nightmare. It's a bit like trying to juggle flaming swords while riding a unicycle. Impressive if you can pull it off, but downright disastrous if you can't. The Union also highlights the eternal dance between ambition and reality. The romanticized narratives of a unified Iberian empire often gloss over the harsh truth. Managing such vast territories required more than just bold proclamations and royal decrees. It took money, lots of it, and a deftness in diplomacy that was sorely lacking at times. As modern observers, we're left to ponder the legacy of this ambitious, yet flawed partnership. The Iberian Union's story is not just about the rise and fall of empires. It's about the enduring human desire to reach beyond the horizon, to forge connections across cultures and continents. It's a tale of dreams and disappointments, of bold ventures, and the harsh lessons of overreach. So, the next time you sprinkle cinnamon on your latte or enjoy a sugary treat, remember the tangled web of history that brought these flavors to your table. The Iberian Union may have been a short-lived chapter in the annals of history, but its ripples are felt to this day. It's a story that reminds us of the power of ambition, the cost of empire, and the inevitable clash between dreams and reality. A tale as old as time, and one that continues to unfold in new and unexpected ways. In the sizzling heart of northeast Africa, where the sun's rays could roast a camel faster than a Spitfire, lay the ancient kingdom of Nubia. Nestled along the life-giving Nile, Nubia wasn't just a barren wasteland of pyramids and sand dunes. Nope, it was the ancient world's version of a bustling highway rest stop, complete with an array of goods that would rival any modern-day duty-free shop. Gold, ivory, and exotic animals were just some of the treasures that made Nubia the place to be, or at least pass through if you were hauling goods across the continent. You see, Nubia had something every real estate agent dreams about: location, location, location. Smack dab between Egypt to the north and the rest of Africa to the south, it was like the connective tissue in a global trade network. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was the ancient world's version of the Autobahn, minus the high-speed chariots. This prime piece of geographic pie allowed Nubia to become the crossroads of Africa, transforming it into a melting pot of cultures, goods, and frankly, a few good old-fashioned power struggles. The Nubians were no dummies. They realized pretty quickly that they were sitting on a gold mine, literally. They were savvy traders before it was cool. Forget Wall Street. These guys were the original market movers and shakers. With gold practically oozing out of the ground, they became the go-to suppliers for one of the most coveted metals of the ancient world. The Egyptians, with their penchant for bling and elaborate tombs, were one of Nubia's best customers. In fact, Egyptian pharaohs couldn't get enough of the shiny stuff to deck out their afterlife digs. But let's not throw a toga party just yet. While the romanticized version of Nubia paints it as a land of endless prosperity and cultural harmony, the reality was a tad less glamorous. Sure, there was profit to be made, but it came with its share of precarious alliances and the occasional hostile takeover attempt. The Egyptians, with their big brother complex, often looked south with a mix of admiration and a little too much interest in Nubia's resources. It was like living next door to a nosy neighbor who keeps trying to borrow your lawnmower, except in this case, the lawnmower was made of gold and ivory. Now, let's talk about ivory. Today, it's a controversial commodity, but back then, it was the ancient equivalent of a luxury car. Nubians had access to herds of elephants, those gentle giants whose tusks were as coveted as gold. The ivory trade was booming, and Nubia's traders knew just how to capitalize on that. They had the goods, they had the contacts, and they had the smarts to get the best deals. It was a win-win for them, until the elephants started getting wise, but that's a story for another day. And then there were the exotic animals. Forget your local zoo. Nubia was the original animal kingdom. From leopards to baboons, these creatures were shipped north to Egypt, where they would either end up as royal pets or, more often than not, in someone's hunting grounds. It was a wild time, both literally and figuratively, with Nubia at the center of it all. While all this trading was happening, Nubia wasn't just sitting back and counting its profits. The trade networks they built were a two-way street. Alongside the flow of goods, there was an exchange of ideas, beliefs, and even fashion tips. Nubia was like the ancient world's fashion week, with styles and trends spreading across borders faster than you could say papyrus. However, let's not forget the human factor in all of this. Behind the glittering facade of wealth and trade, there were people, real people with real stories. The traders who traversed scorching deserts and navigated treacherous waters weren't just transporting goods. They were the lifeline of Nubia's economy. They were the unsung heroes who made sure that the gold reached Egypt and that the ivory made it to the markets. In sum, ancient Nubia was much more than just a geographical footnote in the annals of history. It was a vibrant hub of trade and culture, a place where the world came to exchange not just goods, but ideas and innovations. But like any good story, there's always more beneath the surface. Stay tuned, because the tale of Nubia gets even more intriguing as we delve deeper into its alliances, its conflicts, and its enduring legacy. So, let's dive right into the gears and cogs of Nubian trade, the unsung hero of ancient supply chains. Picture yourself as a Nubian trader, a sun-baked, sand-swept entrepreneur of the ancient world. First off, forget your Google Maps and Waze. You're navigating the Nile and deserts with little more than the stars and a gut feeling. The Nile, you see, wasn't just a scenic backdrop for epic tales. It was the life artery of trade, the ancient superhighway that came with its own set of traffic jams. Think hippo blockades and crocodile toll booths. The Nubians were masters of the river, using boats that were the envy of any ancient nautical enthusiast. These weren't your run-of-the-mill papyrus rafts. No, the Nubians crafted vessels capable of hauling tons of gold, ivory, and animal hides, and they did this with the finesse of a sailor who could read the river's mood better than a modern meteorologist can predict rain. They understood the Nile's seasonal rhythms, knowing when the waters would rise, and when they might leave you high and dry. Once they disembarked from their river cruisers, it was time to tackle the desert. Now, you might think the desert is just a vast, empty expanse of boredom, but for the Nubians, it was a bustling thoroughfare. Caravans of camels, those ships of the desert, trudged along routes that crisscrossed the sands like a well-worn carpet. Each caravan was a miniature mobile market, loaded with goods and overseen by traders who could haggle in more languages than a modern-day diplomat. The camels, true wonder beasts, carried up to 600 pounds on their backs, proving they're the original heavy lifters long before forklifts made it cool. And what were they trading? Glad you asked. Gold, of course, was the headliner, but the Nubians weren't a one-trick pony. They diversified before it was a business buzzword. Ivory, exotic pelts, and ebony wood flowed through these routes as if they were Black Friday specials. These goods didn't just magically appear. They represented the hard-fought spoils of a complex web of alliances and rivalries. Imagine negotiating with a rival tribe for elephant tusks while keeping an eye out for bandits lurking in the dunes. It wasn't for the faint-hearted. Now, let's break down the economics because, let's face it, trade wasn't just a hobby. This was serious business. Nubian traders had an uncanny knack for maximizing profit margins. They understood supply and demand long before Adam Smith put pen to paper. Take gold, for instance. By controlling its flow north to Egypt, they kept prices high, ensuring that the pharaohs had to pay top dollar, well, top debons, since dollars weren't around yet, for their bling. But why stop at the borders? Nubia's reach extended beyond Egypt. They were part of a larger network that stretched to the Red Sea and beyond, linking them to the incense-laden shores of Arabia and the bustling markets of the Mediterranean. They were the ultimate middlemen, connecting regions that might as well have been different planets considering the travel times involved. Speaking of time, journey from Nubia to Egypt could take weeks, depending on the whims of the river and the grit of the desert. And yet, traders braved these routes with a resilience that defies the modern-day grumble about delayed flights. However, let's not romanticize this too much. The life of a trader was fraught with peril. The desert was unforgiving, and the Nile wasn't exactly a lazy river ride. Dangers lurked everywhere, from natural elements to human threats. Bandits were a constant headache, and alliances with local tribes could shift faster than sand dunes in a storm. The romantic notion of the lone trader conquering the wilds is appealing, but the reality was a treacherous dance of diplomacy, survival, and a fair amount of luck. And let's not forget the social fabric woven through these trade networks. The Nubians weren't just moving goods, they were exchanging ideas, forging cultural connections that enriched the ancient world. The traders were cultural ambassadors, bringing back tales of distant lands and introducing new customs and innovations. They were the internet of their time, albeit a bit slower and with a higher risk of dehydration. In essence, Nubian trade was a complex ballet of logistics and human endeavor. It was the ancient world's version of a startup, with all its excitement, risk, and potential for reward. Through the grit and determination of its traders, Nubia became more than just a land of gold. It was a linchpin in the web of ancient commerce and culture. And while we might marvel at the pyramids and the gold, it's these unsung logistics that truly made Nubia tick. Stay tuned, because the story of Nubia is far from over, and the next chapters are packed with as much intrigue and drama as a binge-worthy series. Speaking of intrigue and drama, Nubia's economic strategies could give modern Wall Street a run for its money. The Nubians weren't just traders, they were the shrewd negotiators and deal-makers of the ancient world. Picture them as the ancient version of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, minus the hoodies, but with a lot more gold. They understood that trade wasn't just about moving goods, it was about moving power. And when it came to negotiating with the Egyptians, Nubians played a game of economic chess that would leave even the most seasoned players baffled. So, how exactly did they manage to keep their southern neighbors both satisfied and at bay? It was all about balance, like a tightrope walker juggling golden balls while sidestepping crocodiles. The Nubians, ever the savvy strategists, knew that their golden goose lay in their ability to control the flow of luxury items northward. They had the Egyptians wrapped around their fingers, or perhaps more accurately, their gold-laden wrists. The Egyptians needed Nubian gold for their insatiable appetite for grandeur, and the Nubians were more than happy to oblige, for a price. This wasn't just a simple buy-and-sell transaction. The Nubians cleverly crafted trade deals that ensured a steady income while maintaining their autonomy. They leveraged their unique resources like a seasoned poker player holding a royal flush. In return for gold and ivory, the Egyptians provided grain, linen, and papyrus, commodities that were as essential as your morning coffee. The trick was to keep the Egyptians wanting more without giving them too much control. It was economic diplomacy at its finest, a dance of give and take that kept both sides from drawing their swords. However, these alliances weren't just about goods and gold. They were a complex web of political maneuvering. The Nubians had to constantly assess the Egyptians' shifting political landscape, aligning themselves with the right pharaohs and playing one faction against another when needed. It was like attending an endless office party where everyone wanted to be your friend, but you had to watch your back while sipping on some ancient brew. Behind the scenes, trade was shaping Nubian society in ways that were as transformative as they were subtle. With wealth came power, and with power came the rise of influential city-states like Kerma and Merre. Kerma, often considered one of the oldest urban centers in Africa, became a bustling hub of activity. It wasn't just a city, it was the heart of Nubian life, throbbing with the rhythm of commerce and culture. Archaeological finds reveal that Kerma boasted mud-brick palaces, temples, and royal tombs, each more elaborate than the last. These weren't just buildings, they were statements of power and prosperity, funded by the gold that flowed like a river through Nubian hands. And then there was Merre, the city that rose from the sands like a mirage, but with a lot more staying power. Nestled between the Nile and the Atbara River, Merer became the jewel of the Nubian crown. It wasn't just a city, it was a symbol of Nubian innovation and resilience. Merer was known for its iron production, a technological leap that transformed Nubia's economy. The city was a veritable factory town, with furnaces and forges working day and night to produce iron tools and weapons. This wasn't just a step forward, it was a leap into a new era where Nubia could arm its warriors and plow its fields with the same metal. The wealth generated by trade didn't just build cities, it reshaped the very fabric of Nubian society. The influx of riches led to a stratification, where social status was often tied to one's role in the trade networks. Traders and merchants became the new elite, wielding influence that rivaled that of traditional leaders. It was a society in flux, where the lines between the powerful and the powerless were as shifting as the desert sands. Of course, with wealth came its own set of headaches. The Nubians had to navigate the delicate balance between domestic prosperity and foreign envy. The Egyptians weren't the only ones with an eye on Nubia's riches. Other regional powers, sensing the scent of gold like sharks in the water, occasionally tried to muscle in. The Nubians, however, were adept at playing the Game of Thrones, long before George R.R. Martin made it popular. They forged alliances, brokered peace treaties, and when necessary, showcased their military might to remind everyone that Nubia was no pushover. But let's not get too swept up in the romance of it all. The reality was that trade and politics were intertwined in a dance that was as dangerous as it was profitable. The Nubians had to contend with the logistical nightmare of keeping their trade routes open and safe. Bandits roamed the desert, and rival tribes sometimes saw an opportunity in the chaos. The Nubians responded by organizing caravans that were nothing short of military expeditions, complete with guards who were as skilled with a bow as they were with a bargaining table. In the end, Nubia's trade networks were more than just a means of economic survival. They were the lifeblood of a civilization that managed to carve its name into the annals of history. The ebb and flow of goods along the Nile and across the desert sands were more than transactions. They were the pulse of a vibrant society that thrived on innovation, resilience, and a fair bit of cunning. As we pause to catch our breath, remember that the story of Nubian trade is far from over. We've peeled back the layers of economics and diplomacy, but there's still more to uncover. The rise of powerful city-states, the intricate web of alliances, and the relentless drive for innovation all paint a picture of a civilization that was as complex as it was fascinating. So stay tuned, because the tale of Nubia is like a well-spun yarn, each thread revealing something new and unexpected. Let's peel back the gold leaf and take a closer look at the myths that have woven themselves into the history of Nubian trade. It's easy to imagine a world where Nubians were constantly knee-deep in gold, luxuriating in opulence like ancient Kardashians. But let's be real for a moment. While Nubia was indeed rich in resources, the narrative of endless wealth is more fairy tale than fact. Don't get me wrong, Nubia had its fair share of bling, but it wasn't like every Nubian was walking around in a solid gold toga. The gold mines of Nubia were prolific, sure, but extracting that gold was no walk in the park. It was backbreaking labor under the unforgiving sun, with workers enduring conditions that would make a modern-day sweatshop look like a day spa. This wasn't a scene from a glamorous epic. It was more akin to a gritty survival story. The allure of gold and riches, however, was a powerful tool in the propaganda machine. The Egyptians, who were quite adept at spinning a narrative themselves, often depicted Nubia as a land of untold wealth, a glittering jackpot just waiting to be claimed. This wasn't just about gilded statues and opulent tombs. It was about crafting a story that justified their repeated incursions southward, under the guise of securing trade routes or establishing peace. Behind all that glitz and glam was a complex political landscape that Nubian traders had to navigate with the finesse of a diplomat. The Nubians were no strangers to the art of propaganda themselves. They knew how to present a strong front, often portraying themselves as equals or even superior to the Egyptians in their own records. But the reality was more nuanced. This was a Game of Thrones where economic power was the ultimate prize, and the Nubians were playing chess while others were stuck on checkers. Speaking of games, let's address the notion that Nubian traders were merely pawns in the larger geopolitical chessboard. In truth, they were more like knights, maneuvering with strategic precision. They had to be. The Nile might have been their highway, but it was also a corridor of conflict. The Nubian traders knew when to ally, when to fight, and perhaps most importantly, when to retreat. This wasn't just about survival. It was about maintaining a delicate balance of power. Now, let's talk numbers. The gold trade was a lucrative business, but it wasn't as straightforward as a simple exchange of metal for goods. The Nubians had to contend with fluctuating market demands, variable extraction costs, and the constant threat of raids. They were essentially running a multinational corporation, minus the corporate jets and espresso machines. It required a level of business acumen that would put modern-day CEOs to shame. And what about those legendary caravans, packed to the brim with ivory and exotic goods? Yes, they were real, but they didn't just roll out of the Nubian desert like a parade. Organizing a caravan was a logistical nightmare. Imagine coordinating hundreds of camels, each carrying up to 600 pounds of cargo, across treacherous terrain. The cost of outfitting a single caravan could rival the GDP of a small city-state. It was a high-stakes investment, with returns that could either make or break a trader's fortune. It wasn't just economics that the Nubians had to worry about. The social dynamics were equally intricate. Trade routes were also avenues of cultural exchange, and with that came the spread of ideas, languages, and sometimes even rebellions. The Nubians had to be vigilant, ensuring that the very networks that enriched them didn't also become the channels of their undoing. But let's not forget the allure of the myth itself. The idea of Nubia as a land of wealth and mystery has captivated imaginations for centuries. It's this blend of romance and reality that makes history so compelling. The myths, while exaggerated, capture the spirit of a civilization that thrived against the odds. They remind us of the human tendency to glorify the past, to look at history through rose-tinted glasses while conveniently ignoring the sweat and toil that lay beneath. As we sift through the sands of time, it's important to separate the grains of truth from the dust of fiction. The Nubians were not just gold-laden aristocrats lounging in luxury. They were shrewd entrepreneurs, skilled negotiators, and resilient survivors. They built a legacy not just on the wealth of their resources, but on the strength of their spirit. So, as we continue to explore the intricacies of Nubian trade, remember that beneath the shimmering surface lies a tale of ambition, ingenuity, and resilience. It's a story that's far from over, with more twists and turns than a Nile River bend. Stay tuned, because the next chapter promises even more revelations, and a few surprises, about this remarkable civilization that defied the sands of time. As we continue to sift through the sands of time, separating the grains of truth from the dust of fiction, it becomes evident that Nubia's legacy is far more enduring than the gold that once glimmered in its sun-baked landscapes. While the ancient caravans and bustling trade routes may have disappeared into the annals of history, the impact of Nubian trade is as palpable today as the Nile's relentless flow. For starters, those trade networks weren't just the lifeblood of Nubia. They were the very veins through which cultural and economic currents flowed across Africa and beyond. Picture this. Long before the Silk Road captured imaginations, Nubian trade routes were already weaving a complex tapestry of cultural exchange. Goods were just part of the whole. Ideas, languages, technologies, and yes, even culinary delights traversed these routes, creating a melting pot of innovation and cultural fusion. Nubia was the ancient world's version of a TED talk, sharing insights and sparking revolutions in thought and practice across continents. Take the art of metallurgy, for instance. The Nubians didn't just hoard their iron-smithing secrets, they spread them like wildfire. Merre, with its bustling furnaces and smoke-filled skies, wasn't just a city. It was a beacon of industrial prowess. This technological leap wasn't just about crafting weapons. It was about reshaping societies. Iron tools meant more efficient agriculture, which in turn supported larger populations and ultimately more complex societal structures. It's a classic case of teach a man to fish, or in this case, teach a civilization to smelt. And let's not forget the spread of ideas. Nubian traders were the original influencers, minus the Instagram accounts, but with a lot more cultural clout. They didn't just bring back ivory and gold. They returned with stories, philosophies, and innovations. Through their interactions with Egypt and beyond, They helped shape the religious and cultural landscapes of the regions they touched. The gods they worshipped, the symbols they revered, and the practices they upheld trickled into neighboring societies, leaving a legacy that can still be traced in the cultural DNA of modern Africa. Now, let's talk economic influence. Nubia wasn't just a cog in the wheel of ancient trade, it was the axle around which entire economic systems turned. By controlling the flow of luxury goods, Nubians were able to set prices, dictate terms, and wield influence that reached far beyond their borders. They were the original market disruptors, long before Silicon Valley made it trendy. This wasn't just about gold and ivory, it was about shaping demand, creating dependencies, and ultimately influencing the political landscapes of their trading partners. They understood that trade was as much about power as it was about profit. But here's the kicker. While their economic prowess was legendary, it wasn't infallible. The same networks that brought wealth also brought vulnerability. The Nubians had to learn the hard way that maintaining a monopoly is a bit like juggling flaming torches, thrilling when it works, disastrous when it doesn't. As rival powers emerged and new trade routes were carved, Nubia had to adapt or face obsolescence. It's a timeless lesson in innovation and resilience, one that modern economies would do well to heed. After all, in the fast-paced world of trade, resting on laurels is a surefire way to get left in the dust. So what can today's global market learn from these ancient entrepreneurs? For starters, diversification isn't just a buzzword, it's a survival strategy. Nubia thrived not because it had gold, but because it exploited a variety of resources and maintained a vast network of alliances. In the cutthroat landscape of ancient trade, they understood that putting all your eggs in one basket was as risky as negotiating with a crocodile. Flexibility and foresight were their secret weapons, allowing them to pivot and adapt as circumstances changed. And here's a thought. The Nubians knew the value of cultural exchange, not just as a byproduct of trade, but as a catalyst for growth. In today's interconnected world, where borders are increasingly blurred, the lessons of Nubia remind us that the exchange of ideas and innovations can be as valuable as any physical commodity. It's a reminder that trade isn't just about the bottom line. It's about building bridges, fostering understanding, and creating a shared legacy that transcends the confines of geography. As we look back on the legacy of Nubian trade, it's clear that their influence is woven into the very fabric of history. The echoes of their achievements can be heard in the bustling markets of Africa, in the iron tools that revolutionized agriculture, and in the cultural exchanges that continue to shape societies. It's a testament to a civilization that understood the art of negotiation, the power of innovation, and the enduring value of cultural exchange. In the end, the story of Nubia is a tale of ambition and resilience, of a civilization that mastered the trade game like no other. They weren't just players in the ancient world. They were pioneers, forging paths that would influence generations to come. So, as we wrap up this journey through time, let's raise a metaphorical glass to the Nubians, traders, innovators, and cultural ambassadors who left a legacy that continues to inspire. Their story is a reminder that history is not just a record of what was, but a blueprint for what can be. And in that sense, the tale of Nubia is far from over. It's a chapter in the ongoing story of human ingenuity and the relentless pursuit of progress. If you were to ask the ancient Sumerians where the world began, they'd probably point to a muddy patch between two rivers and say, "Right here in Mesopotamia, my friend." Now, whether they'd actually use the word "my friend" is debatable, but you get the idea. This strip of land, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates, is often poetically called the cradle of civilization. But let's be honest, it was more like the wild, unpredictable nursery where civilization screamed its way into existence. Now, why Mesopotamia? Well, it turns out that being sandwiched between two rivers isn't just good for a killer Instagram view. The Tigris and Euphrates brought the life-giving water essential for agriculture to this otherwise arid region. These rivers, stretching over 200 miles each, were the original water cooler meeting spots where early humans gathered, exchanged ideas, and likely complained about the hot weather and sandy commutes. But don't romanticize those rivers too much. They weren't the calm, meandering streams of a nature documentary. Oh no, these bad boys were unpredictable and moody, with flooding patterns as erratic as a reality TV star. One year, they might generously dump fertile silt across the plains, and the next, they'd decide to wash away your crops with a biblical deluge. It was a high-stakes game of irrigation roulette, and the Sumerians were not exactly holding a winning hand. Faced with this watery dilemma, early Sumerians got innovative, or desperate, depending on how you look at it. They fashioned some of the earliest irrigation systems, a fancy term for digging canals and channels to control water flow. It was like telling the rivers, "You're not the boss of me." These early engineers had to get pretty crafty, and by crafty, I mean they needed a coordinated effort to dig, maintain, and manage these channels. This wasn't just about moving water, it was about moving people. And nothing says, "Let's form a society," like the need for a community ditch-digging project. But managing water wasn't the only challenge. Early agriculture came with its own set of headaches. In a world where pest control was essentially a rock and a prayer, keeping crops alive required creativity and cooperation. This necessity spawned the first inklings of organized society. People who once might have just been neighbors awkwardly waving over fence lines now had to work together, plan together, and occasionally argue over whose goat just trampled the barley. This need for cooperation was the seed from which city-states eventually sprouted. Coordination became the name of the game. If you were going to survive the whims of the rivers and the demands of farming, you needed more than just a friendly handshake agreement. You needed rules, leaders, and perhaps a stern talking-to for the guy who let his sheep wander into the irrigation canals again. And so, the early city-states of Sumer began to rise, not from divine intervention or mystical forces, but from the practical, everyday struggles of managing water and wheat. These weren't just places with fancy ziggurates and bustling markets. They were the first attempts at organized human living. They were the start of something big, something we now call civilization. Of course, with organization came hierarchy. Suddenly, being the best at canal digging could catapult you to local fame. Not quite the cover of Time magazine, but not too shabby either. Leaders emerged, likely those who could shout the loudest or organize the most effective work parties. These proto-politicians had to balance the need for order with the very human desire to occasionally shirk responsibility. And let's not forget the delightful consequence of all this cooperation: taxes. Yes, the need to fund collective projects eventually led to the concept of taxation. Picture an early Sumerian bureaucrat tallying up bushels of barley instead of dollars. It was the start of a long, storied tradition of grumbling about taxes, one that continues to this day. So, as Mesopotamia became the backdrop for humanity's first organized societies, the Tigris and Euphrates were more than just geographical features. They were the temperamental parents of civilization, demanding attention, respect, and a whole lot of elbow grease. While modern-day Mesopotamia might be known for its ancient ruins and archaeological digs, back in the day, it was a bustling hub of activity, ingenuity, and let's face it, a fair bit of chaos. As the early Sumerians navigated the complexities of water management and agriculture, they laid the groundwork for something much larger. They weren't just building canals and planting crops, they were crafting the foundations of human society. And if you think about it, they did it all without the internet, smartphones, or even a decent cup of coffee. Now that's impressive. Now, with no caffeine jolt to keep them going, the Sumerians managed to lay the bricks for what would become the bustling city-states of Uruk and Picture this. Uruk, around 3000 BC, wasn't just a sleepy hamlet by the river, but a thriving metropolis, home to a whopping 50,000 people. That's like cramming half the population of modern-day Reykjavik into mud brick houses and calling it a day. And if you think city life today is chaotic, try navigating the narrow, winding streets of Uruk with a donkey in tow. Uruk was the New York City of its time, minus the skyscrapers and yellow cabs. It was here that the seeds of political structure began to sprout with the emergence of kings and priests, each vying for power in their own subtle, or not so subtle, ways. The priests had the ear of the gods, or at least that's what they claimed, while the kings held the earthly power. It was a dynamic duo that would make Batman and Robin look like amateurs. The priests tended to focus on keeping the gods happy, which likely involved an impressive array of rituals, sacrifices, the occasional divine bribe. Meanwhile, the kings were more about maintaining order, settling disputes, and let's be honest, expanding their influence and wealth. But let's not paint these early kings as just power-hungry maniacs with a penchant for fancy hats. Being a king in ancient Sumer was more about keeping the peace than waging war. Sure, every now and then there was a skirmish over water rights or a disagreement about whose oxen trampled whose barley field, but the real power lay in managing resources and keeping the city running smoothly. This required a meticulous record-keeping system, and thus cuneiform was born. Cuneiform, the world's first writing system, or as I like to call it, the original Microsoft Excel. It was invented around 3200 BC and initially served a very humble purpose, keeping track of who owed what to whom. Forget epic poetry or philosophical treatises. Cuneiform started as a way to tally grain, livestock, and other commodities. Imagine a scribe meticulously pressing a reed stylus into clay tablets, creating wedge-shaped impressions to record transactions. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential. Without cuneiform, the kings and priests would have been lost in a sea of IOUs and forgotten debts. Now, while we're on the subject of debts, let's talk economics. The foundation of these city-states was their ability to manage and trade surplus goods. And when I say surplus, I'm talking about grain, oodles of it. Grain was the currency of the realm, the golden ticket to prosperity. It was stored in massive granaries, essentially ancient Fort Knoxes, guarded as if they were filled with precious jewels. The ability to produce and store grain not only ensured survival during lean times, but also allowed for trade with neighboring regions. Trade routes snaked across the landscape like ancient highways, connecting Sumer with places as far-flung as the Indus Valley and Anatolia. These weren't your typical tourist routes, though. They were fraught with danger, from bandits to treacherous terrain. Yet they were vital to the economy, bringing in metals, timber, and other goods that were scarce in Mesopotamia. In exchange, Sumerians exported textiles, pottery, and their beloved grain. It was an early version of globalization, long before the World Trade Organization made it trendy. But with great trade came great responsibility, and the Sumerians needed to keep tabs on all this bustling commerce. Enter the scribes, who were the unsung heroes of the city-state economy. Armed with their trusty cuneiform tablets, they recorded every transaction, ensuring that the wheels of commerce kept turning. Without them, the economy would have ground to a halt faster than you can say inflation. As these city-states grew, so did their complexity. The political dynamics were akin to a never-ending game of chess, with kings and priests maneuvering for supremacy on the board. Yet, despite the jockeying for power, there was a sense of balance, a recognition that both roles were essential to the city's stability. The priests maintained the spiritual and moral order, while the kings handled the day-to-day governance. It was a delicate dance, and one misstep could lead to chaos. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the harmony of Sumerian society. Life in these city-states was no idyllic paradise. Disease, famine, and the occasional barbarian invasion kept everyone on their toes. Yet, despite the challenges, the Sumerians persevered, laying the groundwork for future civilizations. They were the original urban planners, diplomats, and economists, all rolled into one. So next time you find yourself grumbling about city life and the trials of modern civilization, spare a thought for the Sumerians. They were the pioneers of urban living, tackling the same issues of governance, economy, and social order that we face today. They built the foundations of human society, one cuneiform tablet and one bushel of grain at a time. And while they may not have had Wi-Fi or air conditioning, they certainly knew a thing or two about resilience, innovation, and the art of compromise. Now, if you think modern society with its skyscrapers and smart gadgets is complex, take a step back, way back, to ancient Sumer, where civilization decided to try its hand at social hierarchy. The Sumerian city-states were the original social experiment, a tangled web of class divisions that would make any sociologist twitch. At the top of this social ladder were the aristocrats, probably lounging in their mud-brick villas, sipping on the ancient equivalent of a chilled Sauvignon Blanc, while the common laborers were more likely sweating it out under the unforgiving Mesopotamian sun. In this early social order, being born into the right family was your all-access pass to the good life. The aristocrats, or as I like to call them, the OG influencers, didn't just inherit wealth. They inherited power and prestige. They were the folks who didn't need to wonder if they could afford to send their kids to the best scribble schools. Meanwhile, the common laborers were the backbone of the economy, toiling away in fields, crafting goods, and generally making sure that the city-state didn't collapse into chaos. Now, if you think this sounds eerily familiar, you're not wrong. The echoes of this class division reverberate through time, a reminder that the more things change, the more they stay the same. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the aristocrats. While they enjoyed the perks of privilege, they also had the delightful burden of responsibility, namely, keeping the city-state running smoothly and not infuriating the guards, which was no small task when a bad harvest could send you to the ancient version of the unemployment line. Now, gender roles in Sumerian society were as rigid as the clay tablets they wrote on. Men typically dominated public life, taking roles as farmers, merchants, and scribes. Women, on the other hand, were expected to manage the household, raise children, and occasionally help with agricultural tasks. However, let's not paint all women of Sumer as passive figures in this ancient tapestry. Some managed to climb the social ladder, becoming priestesses or even wielding influence in the temple economy. It was a world where a woman could go from weaving baskets to negotiating temple contracts, showing that even in ancient times, the glass ceiling was made of clay and could be chipped away if you were persistent enough. Just when you think Sumerian society couldn't get more fascinating, along comes the Code of Urnamu, strutting in like the original rulebook for city-state living. Dating back to around 2100 BC, it's the oldest known legal code, and it's packed with laws that are both surprisingly familiar and downright bizarre. It's the ancient world's answer to Judge Judy, complete with penalties that range from fines to, brace yourself, death. But let's focus on the non-lethal side first. The code laid out penalties for theft, assault, and even false accusations. You could almost hear the echoes of modern legal systems in its decrees. But if you think ancient justice was all about fairness and order, think again. The punishment for certain offenses could be as harsh as the desert sun. For instance, if you were caught committing adultery, the code might suggest a punishment as extreme as death. It was a reminder that while our legal systems have evolved, the quest for justice, and its occasional overreach, has deep roots. Yet, amidst the severity, there were also laws that offered protection. The code stipulated compensation for injury, and even provided for the rights of widows and orphans, which shows a glimmer of a welfare system in its infancy. It was, in many ways, a mixed bag of justice, reflecting the complexity of human society trying to balance order with fairness. But the Sumerians weren't just about strict legal codes and rigid social structures. They were also the original economic strategists, juggling trade, agriculture, and resource management like seasoned Wall Street brokers. The city-states were bustling hubs of commerce, with trade routes extending from the Persian Gulf to the Levant. They were the ancient equivalent of Amazon Prime, minus the 2-day shipping. Goods flowed in and out, and with them came ideas, innovations, and the occasional cultural exchange that shaped the region. Now, let's not forget the laborers, the unsung heroes of this grand economic machine. While they might not have been writing legal codes or making trade deals, their relentless work in the fields and workshops was what kept the city-state's heart beating. They were the ones planting the barley, weaving the textiles, and crafting the pottery that filled the markets. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential, and without them, the aristocrats would have found themselves in quite the pickle. As we traverse the dusty streets of these ancient city-states, one thing becomes clear. Sumerian society was as multifaceted as a cuneiform tablet, with each impression telling a story of human endeavor, struggle, and achievement. It was a world where power dynamics, gender roles, and legal systems interwove to create the complex tapestry of civilization. And just like those clay tablets, the impressions left by Sumerian society are still visible today, etched into the fabric of our modern world. Now, hold that thought, because there's more to unravel in the rich history of Sumer. As we explore further, we'll discover how these city-states continued to evolve, how their innovations laid the groundwork for future empires, and how their legacy endures in ways we might not expect. But we'll save that for next time, because let's face it, history is just too good to rush. And speaking of the tapestry of civilization, let's weave our way into the realm of Sumerian technological and cultural innovations, because these folks were doing more than just surviving. They were thriving in ways that would make a Silicon Valley startup blush. First up, let's talk about mathematics and astronomy. You might not peg the ancients as number crunchers, but the Sumerians were the original spreadsheet warriors. They developed a base 60 number system. Yes, that's where our 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle come from. This wasn't just for fun or showing off. It was crucial for everything from trade to astronomy. Now, why did they opt for base 60? Good question. It's all about divisibility. 60 is a wonderfully cooperative number, divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on, which makes it perfect for dividing up fields, calculating taxes, or figuring out how much barley you owe the guy down the road. And let's face it, when you're haggling over sheep or calculating the tribute to appease a cranky deity, having a flexible number system is a lifesaver. Speaking of the heavens, Sumerian astronomers were the ones who first decided that looking up was worth more than a crick in the neck. They meticulously tracked celestial movements, not just for the sheer wonder of it, but to predict seasons, plan agriculture, and perhaps most importantly, interpret the will of the gods. You can almost picture them, eyes glued to the night sky, jarring down the positions of stars and planets, probably wondering why they hadn't invented telescopes yet. Fast forward to literature, where we find an absolute gem in the Sumerian crown, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, if you think modern-day celebrities have big egos, meet Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, who might have been the first historical figure with a PR team. This epic poem, dating back to around 2100 BC, is a tale of friendship, adventure, and the existential dread of mortality. Gilgamesh, part god and part man, embarks on a heroic journey that's like an ancient version of The Hangover meets The Lord of the Rings. But let's not get carried away by the dramatics. While Gilgamesh's exploits, slaying monsters, defying gods, make for a rollicking read, the poem's real strength lies in its exploration of friendship and the inevitability of death. Enter Enkidu, the wild man created by the gods, as a counterbalance to Gilgamesh's arrogance. Their bromance, full of battles and banter, is the emotional core of the story. Enkidu's eventual death sends Gilgamesh spiraling into a quest for immortality, only to learn that even heroes must face the end. It's a timeless theme that resonates with anyone who's ever pondered life's fleeting nature while stuck in traffic. Now, about those exaggerated heroics, was Gilgamesh really a demigod, or just a charismatic ruler with a penchant for tall tales? The truth is likely a mix of myth and reality. Historical records suggest there was indeed a King Gilgamesh, but whether he wrestled divine creatures or just wrestled with local politics is up for debate. The epic, like many ancient texts, reflects not only the values and beliefs of its time, but also the human need to aggrandize our leaders and heroes. After all, who wants to hear about a king who just did paperwork all day? As we unravel these myths, it's crucial to understand their appeal. Sumerians, just like us, longed for stories that transcended the mundane, that offered escape and meaning. These tales provided context for their achievements and failures, offering a narrative that made sense of a chaotic world. And when your daily life involves unpredictable floods and capricious deities, a little escapism goes a long way. But let's not forget the practical side of Sumerian life. All this innovation wasn't just for show. It was about survival, efficiency, and ultimately setting the stage for future civilizations. Their advances in mathematics and astronomy laid the groundwork for later developments in science and technology. Their literature, with its rich themes and complex characters, influenced storytelling for millennia to come. And their ability to blend myth with reality speaks to a universal human trait, the need to understand the world through narrative. In the end, the Sumerians were more than just the sum of their innovations. They were pioneers of human thought, blending practicality with imagination, science with storytelling. As we dig deeper into their contributions, we find a society that wasn't just building the foundations of civilization, but crafting the stories and systems that would define humanity for centuries. And that, my friends, is a legacy worth remembering. As we delve into the twilight of the Sumerian era, it's clear that even the most innovative societies aren't immune to the whims of nature and the harsh realities of human ambition. Like the final act of a tragic play, the decline of the Sumerian city-states was a slow unraveling, marked by both internal strife and external pressures. Imagine a grand tapestry being slowly pulled apart, thread by thread, until all that remains is a shadow of its former glory. First, let's talk environment. The Tigris and Euphrates, those capricious life-givers, had a dark side. Over time, the very irrigation systems that once sustained Sumerian agriculture began to betray them. Constant flooding and poor drainage led to salinization, where the soil became as salty as the Dead Sea. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was an agricultural apocalypse. Imagine trying to grow barley in a salt shaker. Good luck with that. The once fertile fields turned barren, crop yields plummeted, and the breadbasket of Mesopotamia started to look more like a desert pantry. Throw in a side dish of climate change. Yes, even the ancients weren't spared, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Around 2200 BC, a severe drought struck the region, sending temperatures soaring and water levels plummeting faster than a bad cryptocurrency investment. The Sumerians, masters of irrigation though they were, couldn't coax life from parched land. It was a sobering reminder that no amount of human ingenuity can fully tame Mother Nature's wild streak. But wait, there's more. As if environmental calamities weren't enough, the Sumerians also faced threats from outside their mud-brick walls. Enter the Akkadians, led by the legendary Sargon of Akkad, who decided that conquering the Sumerian city-states would make for a nice feather in his imperial cap. Around 2334 BC, Sargon swept through the region like a hot knife through butter, establishing what's often considered the first empire in history. Talk about a hostile takeover. The Sumerian city-states, already weakened by environmental stress, struggled to resist the Akkadian onslaught. Yet the Akkadians weren't the only ones knocking at the door. Fast forward to 2004 BC, and the Elamites crashed the party, sacking the city of Ur and effectively ending the third dynasty of Ur. It was the ancient equivalent of a hostile corporate merger, with one culture absorbing another's assets and leaving the original stakeholders in the dust. By the end of it all, the Sumerian city-states resembled a once-thriving business undone by a series of unfortunate events, both natural and human-made. But let's not dwell too long in the ruins. The Sumerians may have been down, but they were far from forgotten. Their legacy, like a stubborn stain, lingered long after the city-states had crumbled. Take governance, for instance. The Sumerians were the pioneers of organized statehood, crafting political institutions that would influence successors like the Babylonians and Assyrians. Hammurabi's famous code, it didn't spring from nowhere. It was built on Sumerian legal foundations, much like a modern lawyer standing on the shoulders of ancient giants. Architecture, too, bears the Sumerian mark. Those iconic ziggurats, the towering temples that dotted the landscape, laid the groundwork for future architectural feats. They were the original skyscrapers, reaching for the heavens long before Dubai had even a single sandcastle. These monuments weren't just religious centers. They were symbols of civic pride and unity, rallying points for a society that sought to bridge the human and divine. And let's not forget the written word. Cuneiform, that wedge-shaped marvel, was the Rosetta Stone of its time, paving the way for literacy and record-keeping across the ancient world. The Babylonians, Assyrians, and even the Persians owed a debt to the Sumerian scribes who first etched their marks into clay. Without cuneiform, the history of the ancient Near East might have been lost to the sands of time, much like a blockbuster film without its box office receipts. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like a neat wrap-up with a bow on top, think again. The Sumerians left us more than just a legacy of governance, architecture, and writing. They left us with lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the limits of human control. They remind us that innovation and civilization walk a tightrope, always a few missteps away from collapse. Their story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most advanced societies are vulnerable to the unpredictable forces of nature and the inexorable march of history. But let's also indulge in a little romance, because who doesn't love a touch of nostalgia? The Sumerians, with their ziggurats and epic tales, embody the human spirit's relentless quest for knowledge and meaning. They were the dreamers who looked to the stars and sought to understand their place in the cosmos. They were the builders who transformed mud and reeds into cities and stories. And they were the pioneers who laid the foundations for a world that, for better or worse, still bears their imprint. So, as we bid farewell to the Sumerians and their world, let's raise a metaphorical glass to their enduring influence. They were the original architects of human civilization, setting the stage for the grand dramas that would unfold in the centuries to come. And while their cities may have crumbled, their legacy endures, etched into the annals of history, and perhaps more importantly, into the very fabric of what it means to be human. Cheers to that. Sun's barely had a chance to stretch its arms over the horizon, and you're already deep into the grind. Welcome to life as a medieval Fletcher's apprentice, where the rooster crows aren't just your morning alarm. They're a reminder of a relentless schedule that would make even your modern 9-to-5 look like a leisurely stroll through the park. Your day kicks off well before the local baker has even thought about preheating his oven. That's right. The crack of dawn is your call to action, not a gentle wake-up, but more like a swift kick to the day. First things first, you stumble out of your straw bed, the mattress of choice for a noble apprentice like yourself. You might catch a whiff of the last meal you had, yesterday, lingering in the air, but there's no time to linger yourself. The Fletcher's sharp awaits, and so does your master, who's probably already pondering how many arrows you're going to mess up today. You see, fletching isn't just about sticking some feathers on a stick. It's a craft, an art, one that you're expected to learn without dropping the ball, or in this case, the arrow. But let's talk economics, because who doesn't love a good conversation about medieval wages over morning gruel? As an apprentice, you're not exactly swimming in coins. You're more like dog paddling in a puddle. Your salary, and I use that term loosely, is a whopping zero. That's right, zilch, nada, goose egg. In exchange for your hard labor, you get food, a place to sleep, and the privilege of learning a trade. Now, before you think, hey, free education, remember that this isn't some medieval scholarship. It's more like a medieval internship, minus the coffee runs, but plus a lot more blisters. On top of that, the cost of living in the medieval period isn't exactly conducive to splurging on luxuries. A loaf of bread might set you back what would be a couple of dollars today, which doesn't sound too bad until you remember you're earning a grand total of nothing. So, forget about buying that extra tunic or indulging in meat more than once a week. Your diet's pretty much the medieval version of the dollar menu, heavy on grains, light on flavor. Now, let's dive into the Fletcher's workshop, where the hierarchy is as rigid as the arrows you're trying to perfect. At the top, you have the master Fletcher, the king of this small domain. He's the one with the skills, the experience, and most importantly, the customers. Below him might be a journeyman or two, skilled workers who've completed their apprenticeships but aren't quite ready to set up shop themselves. And then, at the very bottom of this totem pole, there's you, the apprentice, the newbie, the one who gets the glamorous task of preparing materials, which often involves a lot of tedious tasks like plucking feathers from unfortunate birds and sorting them by size, color, and quality. Your master probably sees you as a necessary inconvenience, a future hope for a larger workforce, but for now, a liability. You're expected to observe, learn, and most importantly, not ruin his reputation by sending out arrows that fly like drunken pigeons. But hey, at least you're not alone in this medieval misery. Across Europe, thousands of apprentices are in the same boat, or should I say, the same workshop, enduring the same daily grind. Misery loves company, right? This apprenticeship isn't just about learning to make arrows. You're also learning about the delicate dance of social dynamics. You have to navigate the whims of your master, the camaraderie/competition with your fellow apprentices, and the occasional scolding from a journeyman who's decided to take you under his less-than-gentle wing. This hierarchy is as much about maintaining order as it is about passing on knowledge. It ensures the skills of fletching are transferred efficiently, if not always kindly. And while it might sound like a raw deal, there's a silver lining, or at least a smudged one. If you can stick it out, if you can endure the early mornings, the meager meals, and the constant pressure to perform, there's a chance you might one day become a journeyman yourself. Then you'll finally earn some coin, maybe even start saving for your own shop. But that's a few years down the road. For now, it's back to sorting feathers and dreaming of the day you'll be the one giving orders. Keep your head down, your arrows straight, and remember, this too shall pass, even if it passes like an arrow in slow motion. Speaking of keeping your head down, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of what it really takes to make those arrows fly true. You see, the art of fletching is a bit like baking a cake. Everyone loves the end result, but no one wants to hear about how you accidentally used salt instead of sugar. So, let's break it down without pulling any punches. First up, wood selection. It's not just about grabbing the nearest stick and calling it a day. Oh no, my friend, this is where the romance begins to unravel. The choice timber for arrows. That would be ash, yew, or hazel, with ash being the medieval equivalent of the Swiss army knife of woods. It's straight, strong, and just flexible enough to endure the rough and tumble life of an arrow. But here's the catch. Finding the perfect piece could be as rare as a sunny day in England. You're looking for a straight grain, free from gnats, and that means endless hours in the forest judging trees like a particularly picky talent scout. And remember, you're doing this without a chainsaw or a comfy pair of Timberlands. Once you've got your wood, you're going to need a sharp knife. Cue the potential for injuries. Because nothing says apprenticeship like a few nicks and scars. Medieval doctors aren't exactly known for their advanced medical knowledge, so you'd better hope you have a steady hand. After all, hygiene back then was a bit of an afterthought, and a simple cut could lead to a nasty infection faster than you can say bubonic plague. So, when you're whittling away at that wood, just remember, every cut is a risk, and every risk is a reminder of why apprenticeships are paid in experience, not cash. Next, there's the business of fletching. We're talking feathers. Goose feathers, to be specific, because apparently geese didn't have enough to worry about with all the plucking and honking. The feathers need to be sorted, trimmed, and attached to the arrow shaft with painstaking precision. It's enough to make a perfectionist weep, because if they're even a smidge off, your arrow will spiral out of control like a toddler on a sugar high. And the glue, none of this modern adhesive magic. We're talking about concoctions made from hide glue or egg whites, with a dash of medieval hope that it'll hold together when it counts. Then there's the metallurgy, because nothing says fun like a heart forge and molten metal. Making arrowheads is not for the faint-hearted or those with a penchant for daydreaming. You've got to get the temperature just right. Otherwise, you end up with a lump of metal that's about as useful as a chocolate teapot. And let's not forget, you're doing this in a workshop with zero health and safety regulations. No goggles, no gloves, just you, your wits, and a very real chance of setting your eyebrows on fire. But the real kicker, you're not just learning how to make arrows. You're learning how to make arrows that people will trust with their lives. Whether it's a hunter looking to feed his family or a soldier aiming to survive the next battle, your craftsmanship is the difference between success and failure. It's a heavy burden, but one that's been shouldered by Fletchers for centuries. The myth of the romanticized craft, of the noble artisan honing his skills in serene solitude, is just that, a myth. The reality is a grind, a test of patience and fortitude, where every day is a lesson in humility and perseverance. Now, while I could wax lyrical about the beauty of a perfectly crafted arrow, let's not sugarcoat it. This is hard, repetitive work. It's not for everyone, and certainly not for anyone who craves variety. Each day blends into the next, marked by the same tasks, the same challenges, and the same frustrations. Yet, amidst the monotony, there's a sense of purpose. Because at the end of the day, when you see an arrow fly true, you know it's the result of countless hours of toil and dedication. So, as you're sanding down that shaft for the umpteenth time, remember that you're not just shaping wood, you're shaping your future. Every splinter you avoid, every feather you perfectly align, brings you one step closer to mastering a craft that's as old as civilization itself. And who knows, maybe one day you'll be the master Fletcher, watching as some fresh-faced apprentice navigates the same trials and tribulations, dreaming of the day they'll earn the right to call themselves a journeyman. In the meantime, keep your fingers intact, your blades sharp, and your spirits high. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that even the most mundane tasks can lead to greatness, one arrow at a time. Yet, as you're sanding down that shaft for the umpteenth time, you're doing more than just preparing for the next hunting trip. You're feeding the beast that is medieval warfare. Because let's be honest, dear apprentice, the Middle Ages weren't exactly known for their peace treaties and diplomatic resolutions. No, this was a time when disputes were settled not in boardrooms, but on battlefields, where arrows were the PowerPoint presentations of their day. Direct, impactful, and often the deciding factor in a heated argument. Welcome to the socio-political landscape of the Middle Ages, where archery wasn't just a skill, it was a necessity. If you ever wondered why you're working your fingers to the bone, look no further than the 100 Years' War, that delightful series of conflicts between England and France that lasted, well, 116 years. Talk about a misnomer, right? This wasn't just a long family feud. It was a massive job security program for Fletchers like your master, where the demand for arrows skyrocketed faster than the prices at a medieval alehouse on payday. In this era, an army without archers was like a rock band without a drummer, still functional, but missing its rhythm. The English longbowmen in particular were the rock stars of medieval warfare. Think of them as the Freddie Mercurys of the battlefield, commanding, precise, and leaving a lasting impact. Their longbows, which could reach targets up to 250 yards away, were the envy of Europe and a nightmare for the French cavalry. And where did those arrows come from? You guessed it, the sweat and toil of Fletchers and their trusty apprentices. Now, you might be picturing these archers as merry men in tights, Robin Hooding their way through history with a wink and a nod. But let's bust that myth right open. These were professional soldiers, often drawn from the ranks of commoners, whose livelihoods depended on their skill with a bow. They practiced diligently, sometimes mandated by law, to spend Sundays honing their craft, instead of idly lounging about. In fact, during the reign of Edward Roman III, it was required that every man in England practice archery every Sunday. Forget about lazy weekends. This was a national pastime with deadly serious implications. The demand for arrows wasn't just about quantity, it was about quality. A single English archer might carry 60 to 72 arrows into battle, and considering a typical engagement could involve thousands of bowmen, we're talking about a military-industrial complex before the term even existed. The pressure on you as an apprentice is immense. Your master might bark orders, reminding you that a single defective arrow could mean the difference between life and death for a soldier. No pressure, right? Documents from the period, such as the Ordinance of the Staple in 1363, list detailed requirements for arrow production, underscoring the meticulous standards expected from Fletchers. This wasn't just about creating weapons. It was about crafting precision instruments of war, each arrow a testament to your patience and dedication. And let's not forget the economic stakes. A skilled Fletcher could command good money, but apprentices like you had to earn their stripes, proving their worth with every carefully crafted shaft and perfectly aligned feather. The medieval economy was a tapestry of trade and taxes, where guilds held sway, ensuring that only those who met their rigorous standards could call themselves true Fletchers. The guilds were the gatekeepers of quality, their rules as strict as a Cistercian monk's vow of silence. You were expected to learn the craft inside out, mastering each step from wood selection to the final inspection. And if you dared to cut corners, well, let's just say the guilds didn't take kindly to shoddy workmanship. But amidst the grind, there's a sense of being part of something bigger, a vast network that spans from the forests of England to the battlefields of Agincourt. You're not just making arrows, you're contributing to the defense of your homeland, shaping history one fletched shaft at a time. It's a romantic notion, sure, but also a brutal reality where your work is scrutinized, and your mistakes could echo in the cries of battle. As you fumble with feathers, cursing under your breath, remember that this apprenticeship is a microcosm of the medieval world, a place where every task, no matter how mundane, has its purpose in the grand scheme of things. You're learning not just a trade, but a way of life, grounded in the harsh truths of survival and the pursuit of excellence. And while it might feel like a thankless task, know that Fletchers were the unsung heroes of their time, their craftsmanship leaving a mark on history as indelible as the arrows they unleashed. So, as you count the days until you can shed the title of apprentice, take heart in the knowledge that you're part of a legacy, a lineage of artisans whose work, though often invisible, was crucial to the power dynamics of the Middle Ages. Keep your arrows straight, your spirits high, and your eye on the next target. Remember, in a world ruled by kings and conquest, it's the Fletchers who armed the legends, one arrow at a time. Now, as you're contemplating whether your future holds the promise of mastering this age-old craft, or just more time spent in the trenches of apprenticeship, let's peel back the layers of this medieval onion and see what's really going on. Spoiler alert, it's not all sunshine and roses, but you probably guessed that already. First off, let's talk about your prospects. You're an apprentice now, sure, but the leap to journeyman isn't exactly a hop, skip, and a jump. It's more like a marathon through a bureaucratic maze. Remember the guilds, those lovely organizations that control everything from the quality of your work to how much you'll eventually earn. Yeah, they're your gatekeepers to advancement. To make the jump to journeyman, you'll have to prove your skills, and that means creating a masterpiece, a piece of work that meets the guild's rigorous standards. Think of it as a medieval thesis, but with more splinters and fewer footnotes. But before you get too excited, Know that the guilds don't hand out journeyman status like candy at a parade. No, they're more like a bouncer at an exclusive club, letting in only those who meet their strict criteria. We're talking about a system as rigid as a knight's armor. And it's not just about skills, it's also about who you know. Networking isn't a modern invention, my friend. Back then, the patrons and connections you made could be just as crucial as your arrow-making prowess. Now, let's address this myth of upward mobility. The romantic notion that hard work inevitably leads to success is a tale as old as time and just as fictional as dragons. Yes, there are success stories, but for every master Fletcher who made it big, there were countless others who languished in obscurity. The guilds kept a tight lid on the number of masters allowed, maintaining a delicate balance to prevent market saturation and keep profits high. So, while the dream of owning your own shop is alluring, the reality is a crowded field with limited open spots. Even if you do make it to journeyman, you're not exactly rolling in wealth. Journeymen earned a wage, sure, but it was barely enough to cover the essentials. Some historical records suggest a journeyman might earn roughly 3 to 4 pence a day. To put that in context, a pair of shoes could set you back about 6 pence. So, while you're no longer working for free, you're not exactly living the high life either. It's more like moving from the kiddie pool to the shallow end of the adult pool. Progress. Yes, prosperity. Hold that thought. And if you've got your sights set on becoming a master, buckle up. You'll need the approval of the guild, which means paying hefty fees and often enduring years of additional work experience. It's a bit like being stuck on a medieval hamster wheel, where every step forward feels like 2 steps back. And let's not forget the master's examination, a test of your skills under the scrutinizing eyes of guild members who have seen it all. If you think your current master is tough, just wait until you face the collective judgment of the guild's Grand Council. But wait, there's more. The guilds were also the arbiters of quality and conduct. They dictated everything from the types of materials you could use to the prices you could charge. These weren't suggestions, but firm mandates that ensured no one Fletcher could undercut another. It was a system designed to keep the peace and maintain standards, but it also stifled innovation and limited competition. So while you might dream of revolutionizing the fletching industry, the reality is you'll be towing the line more often than not. This brings us to the rare opportunity of becoming a master Fletcher. If you're one of the fortunate few who manage to navigate the labyrinth of guild bureaucracy and emerge victorious, congratulations. You've reached the pinnacle of your profession. But don't start celebrating just yet. Running your own shop comes with its own set of challenges. You're not just crafting arrows anymore. You're managing a business, dealing with customers, and ensuring your apprentices don't muck things up. It's a juggling act worthy of a circus performer, with the added pressure of maintaining the guild's standards and keeping your customers happy. Throughout all this, the guilds remain your constant companions, or perhaps your constant overseers. They're the ones keeping the trade in check, ensuring every Fletcher adheres to their strict codes. It's a system that offers protection but stifles personal ambition. You might find yourself longing for a taste of freedom, a chance to break free from the guild's grasp and forge your own path. But in the medieval world, where stability was prized above all, the guilds were often seen as a necessary evil, keeping chaos at bay and ensuring the survival of trades. So, where does this leave you, the humble apprentice with dreams of greatness? Well, you've got a long road ahead, filled with challenges and opportunities. The path isn't easy, and there are no guarantees. But if you've got the determination, the skill, and a little bit of luck, you might just forge a future for yourself in the world of fletching. And who knows, maybe one day you'll be the one telling tales of the trials and triumphs of the trade to a wide-eyed apprentice, passing on the legacy of this age-old craft. As you ponder your future, remember that the story of fletching is a microcosm of the medieval world, a place of rigid hierarchies, fierce competition, and relentless pursuit of excellence. It's a world where the myth of upward mobility dances tantalizingly before your eyes, even as the stark realities of the guild system hold you firmly in place. But through it all, there's a sense of purpose, a connection to the past, and a hope for a better future. So, keep crafting those arrows, dreaming of the day you'll leave your mark on history. Because while the path may be fraught with challenges, it's also rich with opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. And in a world where Fletchers arm the legends and shape the course of history, who's to say you won't be the next great master of the craft? As you ponder your future, Remember that the story of fletching is a microcosm of the medieval world, a place of rigid hierarchies, fierce competition, and relentless pursuit of excellence. It's a world where the myth of upward mobility dances tantalizingly before your eyes, even as the stark realities of the guild system hold you firmly in place. But through it all, there's a sense of purpose, a connection to the past, and a hope for a better future. And this hope, however slim, is what keeps the wheels of medieval society turning. Now, let's zoom out of the Fletcher's workshop and take a gander at the bigger picture. Tradespeople in the Middle Ages weren't just the unsung heroes of the economy, they were the economy's backbone. They were the folks who built, quite literally, the medieval world. You think of them as the original gig workers, minus the apps and the 5-star ratings. From blacksmiths pounding out horseshoes to weavers spinning wool into garments, these artisans kept the wheels of commerce well-oiled and moving. But despite their importance, tradespeople often found themselves in a societal no-man's land. They weren't part of the nobility, who were busy jousting and plodding, nor were they peasants tilling the land. Instead, they occupied a middle ground, part of the burgeoning middle class that medieval Europe was slowly, grudgingly, beginning to recognize. This was a time when social mobility was about as fast as a turtle on a leisurely stroll. But if you were a skilled tradesperson, it offered a rare glimmer of opportunity to inch up the social ladder. Let's bust a few myths about medieval trades while we're at it. Ever hear someone say, "They don't make them like they used to"? Well, that phrase probably originated in the Middle Ages, when craftsmanship was a matter of life and death, not just a marketing slogan. The quality of a product could mean survival in a skirmish or a warm winter night. But let's not get misty-eyed about it. The reality was a grueling daily grind, not the romantic craft fare we might imagine today. You didn't just leisurely carve a masterpiece while sipping on a tankard of ale. You worked relentlessly, day in and day out, often in conditions that would make a coal miner cringe. The romantic view of medieval trades often glosses over the grit involved. In truth, the apprentice's life was a mix of monotony and rigor. You learned by doing, which meant endless repetition, until your hands moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. And while the romantic notion of the master craftsman painstakingly perfecting his trade in solitude sounds like a fairy tale, the reality was much noisier and messier. Workshops were bustling hubs of activity, filled with the clatter of tools, the sizzle of forges, and the ever-present smell of sweat and toil. Yet, despite the hardships, the rewards for perseverance were tangible. A skilled tradesperson could achieve a level of economic stability that was largely out of reach for the average peasant. They could earn enough to provide for their families, and maybe even afford a few luxuries, like a second tunic or a loaf of bread with a side of cheese. Fletchers, in particular, held a unique position in this societal tapestry. Their craft went beyond mere utility. It was essential to the defense and expansion of kingdoms. Arrows they created were extensions of the archer's will, the silent messengers in the cacophony of battle. In many ways, Fletchers were the arms dealers of their day, providing the tools for conflicts that shaped history. Their craft was both revered and feared, with the power to determine the outcomes of wars and skirmishes. Consider the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where English longbowmen, armed with arrows crafted by Fletchers, decimated the French forces. It's easy to romanticize the victory, but it was a brutal reminder of the Fletchers' vital role. Those arrows, each a product of sweat and skill, were the silent architects of victory. The Fletchers' contribution to such events was invaluable, even if history doesn't always record their names in the annals of glory. But let's not kid ourselves. The life of a Fletcher's apprentice was no walk in the medieval park. It required a resilience akin to the toughest of today's endurance athletes. You had to endure the physical demands of the job, the mental strain of mastering a complex craft, and the social dynamics of life in a workshop. It was a test of character as much as skill, a proving ground for those who aspired to mastery. As we wrap up this journey through the world of medieval fletching, it's clear that the legacy of these artisans is as enduring as the arrows they crafted. They were the unsung heroes of their time, their work quietly shaping the course of history. And while their craft might have been romanticized over the centuries, the reality was a testament to human endurance and ingenuity. So, as you lay your head down on your straw mattress, dreaming of the day you'll become a master Fletcher, Take pride in the knowledge that you're part of a tradition as old as civilization itself. You're not just crafting arrows, you're crafting history, one fletched shaft at a time. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, your name will be remembered as one of those who armed the legends and left a mark that, like a well-aimed arrow, flies straight and true through the annals of time. As the candlelight flickers and the medieval night wraps its cloak of darkness around you, remember that the path you've chosen isn't just a career, it's a calling that has withstood the test of time, shaping the destinies of nations and the lives of those who dared to dream. So, keep your chin up, your hands steady, and your aim true, for the world of medieval fletching is as much about heart as it is about skill. And in the grand tapestry of history, your contribution is a thread that binds the past to the present, weaving a story that will be told for generations to come. You pry your eyes open in a room that's colder than your ex's heart and surprise. You're in 18th century Paris, but before you can marvel at the charms of the past, the reality of your situation hits you like a baguette to the face. Central heating, non-existent. So you roll out of bed, still groggy, and into a world where your morning routine is about to get as medieval as it sounds. First things first, forget about that hot shower. Instead, you're greeted by a bowl of frigid water that's been sitting out overnight. Splash it on your face if you dare, but don't expect any L'Oreal products to help. With indoor plumbing a distant dream, the chamber part is your best friend, or worst enemy, depending on your aim and tolerance for unpleasant aromas. And speaking of unpleasant aromas, let's talk wigs. These powdered marvels of fashion were often a lice hotel. And remember, your nitpicking skills are more vital now than your smartphone. Breakfast calls, and you shuffle to the table. Now, if you're thinking of pancakes or fresh juice, you're fresh out of luck. Instead, you'll sip on wine like it's your morning coffee. Why wine? Because the water's as suspect as a used car salesman. The Seine River may be picturesque, but it's also the city's landfill. Drinking water from it. That's how you get a one-way ticket to a medieval doctor, and trust me, you don't want that. Your breakfast bread is hard enough to be a lethal weapon, perfect for dunking in your wine to soften it up. But all this wine for breakfast isn't about embracing an early buzz, it's just survival. The cost of living is a different beast altogether. If you're an artisan, you're earning around 15 sous a day, and bread alone could eat up half of that. Meanwhile, if you're a noble, your biggest concern is whether the lace on your cuff is this season's shade of white. Paris is a city of contrasts. The opulence of Versailles is just a carriage ride away, but for most, it's a world apart. Economic disparity is as pronounced as the powdered wigs are tall. The upper crust lives in luxury, while the common folk are left to navigate a world where economic inequality isn't just a talking point, it's the air you breathe. The Estates General, the political body meant to represent all classes, is about as fair as a rigged carnival game. And you, my friend, are definitely not winning any prizes today. This morning routine is just a taste of the challenges people face daily. It's a testament to human resilience, or perhaps just stubbornness. But as you take a swig of that breakfast wine, you realize that surviving 18th century Paris isn't about romanticizing the past. It's about appreciating the convenience of a hot shower and a bug-free bed in the present. Stay tuned, because your day in Paris is just getting started, and it's bound to get even more interesting. So, you've downed your breakfast wine like a champ and steeled yourself for the chaos of the Parisian streets. Time to step outside and experience the city in all its grimy glory. Let's talk about the marketplace, where the real action happens. Picture a bustling scene that's less a charming postcard and more a medieval marsh pit. Here, the air is thick with the scent of sweat, livestock, and desperation. If you thought Black Friday was intense, you haven't met a Parisian market crowd in the 1700. The marketplace is a cornucopia of chaos, where haggling is an art form and the price of bread is the talk of the town. Bread isn't just a dietary staple, it's practically a barometer for social unrest. In fact, the average Parisian gobbles down about 2 pounds of it a day, but with the price of a loaf often consuming over half of a laborer's daily wage, bread can make or break spirits, and sometimes windows. Enter the infamous baguette riots, where the cost of bread skyrocketed faster than a modern-day IPO. In 1775, the Flour War erupted due to bread shortages, setting off a series of riots that were less about gluten and more about gut-wrenching hunger. Imagine marbs storming bakeries, not for artisanal croissants, but for survival. This wasn't a scene out of a romantic French film. It was a harsh reality. Louis Roman XVI, our beleaguered monarch, was left scratching his powdered head, wondering how his kingdom had come to this. Spoiler alert, it's what happens when you spend more on Versailles chandeliers than on feeding your people. But bread wasn't the only thing heating up. Politically, Paris was a powder keg, and the monarchy's finances were as stable as a Jenga tower in a windstorm. Louis Roman XVI inherited a kingdom drowning in debt, and his attempts at financial reform were about as successful as teaching a cat to fetch. His finance minister, Jacques Necker, tried to introduce measures that would make the fiscal system fairer, but vested interests and good old-fashioned royal stubbornness thwarted him at every turn. Throw in the Enlightenment's radical ideas floating around like a rebellious breeze, and you've got a recipe for revolution. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau were the rock stars of their age, challenging the status quo and inspiring the common folk to question why they were knee-deep in muck while the aristocracy lived it up in Versailles. These ideas were more contagious than the lice likely thriving in your wig. Speaking of muck, let's talk about the streets themselves. Romanticized views of Parisian street life often skip over the fact that sanitation was a foreign concept. The streets were open sewers, with chamber parts emptied directly onto the cobblestones below. If you've ever had the misfortune of stepping in something unpleasant, multiply that by 1,000. Navigating these streets required agility and a nose of steel. Watch your step and your head. There's a reason umbrellas were invented. The Seine, that picturesque river winding through the city, was less a romantic backdrop and more an olfactory assault. It served as a convenient dumping ground for every conceivable type of waste. Forget about a leisurely riverside stroll unless you enjoy the aroma of eau de sewage. And safety. The streets were a veritable obstacle course of pickpockets, con artists, and the occasional marauding mob. Even the most streetwise Parisian couldn't let their guard down for a second. But here's the kicker. Despite the grime and the grime, there was a certain allure to this chaotic city. Paris was a hub of cultural and intellectual activity, a place where ideas were exchanged as freely as insults at the market. The city was alive with energy and a sense of possibility, even if that possibility often came with a side of pestilence. So, as you wander the streets, dodging both horse-drawn carriages and less than savory puddles, remember that this is a city on the brink. The very air is electrified with change, and you're in the midst of a historical moment that's about to redefine not just France, but the world. Just try not to let the romance of it all blind you to the very real dangers lurking around every corner. Stay tuned, because your day in Paris is far from over, and the real revolution has yet to begin. As you navigate this vibrant mess, keep your wits about you and your shoes clean, or as clean as they can be under the circumstances. The streets have served you a slice of Parisian life that's both exhilarating and mildly terrifying, and now it's time to dive into the cerebral chaos of 18th century Paris, the salons and theaters where minds, rather than fists, clashed daily. These cultural hubs were like the Twitter of the Enlightenment era, but with fewer trolls and more powdered wigs. Salons were the playgrounds of the intellectual elite, where philosopher kings like Voltaire and Rousseau debated everything from the nature of man to whether cake should be considered a breakfast food. Salons. Imagine dimly lit rooms filled with the who's who of Parisian society, gathered not to gossip about the latest fashion faux pas, but to dissect the human condition. The irony. While these gatherings were hotbeds of radical thought, they were often hosted by wealthy women of the aristocracy, the very class the Enlightenment was preparing to upend. These salonières, like Madame Geoffrin and Madame de Staël, were the gatekeepers of intellectual discourse, proving that even in an age of revolutionary ideas, it was still who you knew, not what you knew. But before you start romanticizing these gatherings as the ultimate intellectual utopia, remember this. Access was as exclusive as a modern-day tech conference. Unless you were a luminary or possessed a social rank higher than your average chimney sweep, your chances of entry were slimmer than the lead in your morning wine. And while these salons were buzzing with chatter about liberty and equality, the reality was less egalitarian and more you can't sit with us. Now, if salons were the brain's playground, then theaters were the heart stage. The Comédie Française was the crown jewel of Parisian theater, a place where you could catch the latest Molière play and rub elbows with the city's elite, if you could afford the ticket, which cost more than a labourer's weekly wage. But if you were one of the lucky few who could snag a spot in the pit, standing room only, mind you, you'd be treated to performances that were as much about social commentary as they were about entertainment. The theatre wasn't just a place to see and be seen. It was a microcosm of the tensions brewing throughout the city. Plays often pushed the boundaries of acceptable discourse, poking fun at the aristocracy and questioning societal norms. Each sarcastic line, delivered by an actor, resonated with an audience that was increasingly dissatisfied with the status quo. It's like watching a late-night talk show host roast the political elite, only with more frills and fewer commercial breaks. As you stroll through these cultural epicenters, you can almost hear the echoes of Voltaire's wit and Rousseau's revolutionary fervor. Voltaire, the ever-skeptical critic of church and state, was like the Enlightenment's answer to a stand-up comedian, using satire as his weapon of choice. His sharp observations on society weren't just for laughs. They were a call to arms, inspiring the masses to consider that maybe, just maybe, they were being played by the powers that be. But let's not mythologize him too much. Voltaire was also a shrewd investor who profited handsomely from his ventures, proving that even philosophers have bills to pay. Rousseau, on the other hand, was the poster child for the noble savage ideal, romanticizing the simplicity of nature, while conveniently ignoring the fact that indoor plumbing wasn't exactly a perk of the natural world. His ideas about the social contract laid the groundwork for modern democracy, even if his personal life was a hot mess. The man who penned treatises on child-rearing famously abandoned his own kids, a fact conveniently glossed over by those who idolized him. Just goes to show, even the greatest minds have their contradictions. These thinkers weren't just spinning tales for the heck of it. They were planting seeds of discontent that would eventually blossom into full-blown revolution. Enlightenment ideas were the intellectual kindling that set the world on fire, challenging the notion that power should be concentrated in the hands of the few. But while the scholars and aristocrats debated lofty ideals, the average Parisian was more concerned with the immediate reality of putting bread on the table and dodging the latest tax hike. And then there's the myth of the Enlightenment as a time of universal progress. Sure, it sounds great on paper. All men are created equal and all that jazz. But let's not forget that men often excluded women, peasants, and pretty much anyone who wasn't a land-owning male. The Enlightenment illuminated the path to modern democracy, but it also cast long shadows, revealing the stark inequalities that persisted even as the age of reason dawned. So, as you navigate the salons and theaters of 18th century Paris, remember that for every revolutionary idea championed within their walls, there was a world outside that remained stubbornly unchanged. The very class structures these intellectuals sought to dismantle were the barriers that kept most Parisians from participating in the cultural renaissance happening right under their noses. The art, the music, the debates, these were the glittering veneer of a society on the brink of transformation. Beneath the surface, however, was a city grappling with the same old issues: poverty, inequality, and a king whose financial acumen was more fiction than fact. The cultural hubs of Paris were alive with possibility, yet they were also a reminder of the rigid structures that defined and confined 18th century life. So, as you find yourself swept up in the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, don't forget to keep a foot firmly planted in reality. The salons and theaters may offer a glimpse into a world of ideas, but it's the streets of Paris that reveal the true state of the nation, a nation on the cusp of change, whether it's ready for it or not. Stay tuned, because this historical roller coaster is far from over, and the next act promises to be one for the ages. As you step away from the intellectual salons and the alluring clamor of the theaters, you find yourself back on the cobblestone streets of Paris. Here, the real drama unfolds, not in the witty exchanges of philosophers, but in the sweat and toil of its working class. Welcome to the labor force of 18th century Paris, where the daily grind isn't just an idiom but a literal description of life. Let's start with the artisans, those skilled laborers who could be considered the backbone of Parisian society. These folks were the original gig workers, crafting everything from shoes to silverware, often in cramped workshops that would make a modern cubicle feel palatial. Their wages, a pittance. Think 15 sous a day if you were lucky, just enough to keep the wolf from the door, or more accurately, to keep yourself from joining the wolves in howling despair. And here's the kicker. These were the lucky ones. Artisans had skills that were in demand, but what about the unskilled laborers? They were the Uber drivers of their day, hustling for whatever work they could find, often backbreaking and sometimes outright dangerous. But let's not forget the women, who faced a different kind of grind. Picture a world where gender roles are as rigid as a starched cravat. Women of the lower classes worked, of course, because survival wasn't gender exclusive. They toiled as laundry maids, seamstresses, and sellers in the markets, earning even less than their male counterparts. And if the pay disparity sounds familiar, that's because it is. A tale as old as time, or at least as old as Paris. Meanwhile, the upper-class ladies, those fortunate enough to avoid manual labor, were trapped in a gilded cage of societal expectations. Their job, to marry well, host salons, and produce heirs. A different kind of labor, but one with its own set of unforgiving demands. Now, let's peek through the gilded windows of the aristocracy. While the common folk were hustling just to put bread on the table, the nobles were living it up in opulent mansions, swathed in silks and dripping in jewels. Their biggest worry was whether their latest wig was tall enough to scrape the ceiling. The irony, despite this extravagant lifestyle, many aristocrats were drowning in debt, victims of their own lavish tastes and the Versailles lifestyle that demanded constant one-upmanship. They were the original Keeping Up with the Joneses, only with powdered wigs and a penchant for Rococo everything. Economic disparity in Paris was as wide as the Seine and just as complicated. The gap between the haves and the have-nots wasn't just a talking point. It was a chasm that defined every aspect of life. While the aristocracy frittered away fortunes on frivolities, the rest of Paris scrounged for survival. And let's be honest, when the price of a loaf of bread can spark a riot, you know the system's got issues. Yet there was a persistent myth of upward mobility, a tantalizing whisper that anyone could rise above their station. Spoiler alert, this was mostly a fairy tale. Sure, there were a few rags-to-riches stories. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the son of a draper, rose to become Louis Roman XIV finance minister, but such stories were the exception, not the rule. For the vast majority, social mobility was as elusive as a Parisian summer without rain. These economic realities didn't just fuel individual struggles, they were the tinder for a much larger fire. The inequality was a ticking time bomb, one that philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau were all too happy to light. Their writings fanned the flames of discontent, making ordinary Parisians question why they were shouldering the burden of a nation while the aristocracy danced the night away. And then there's the tax system, a maze of levies and dues that would baffle even the most seasoned accountant. The peasants and the burgeoning middle class, the so-called Third Estate, bore the brunt of the tax burden, while the clergy and nobility enjoyed exemptions. Imagine living in a world where the more you had, the less you paid. Actually, maybe don't imagine, it might hit a little too close to home. For many Parisians, the daily struggle was a balancing act on the edge of poverty. The threat of famine loomed large, with bread prices as volatile as a modern-day stock market. In such an environment, the idea of revolution wasn't just appealing, it was inevitable. The social contract was fraying at the seams, and everyone could feel it. So here you are, wandering the streets of 18th-century Paris, caught in the crossfire between rich and poor, men and women, the powerful and the powerless. It's a city on the brink, teetering between the old world and the new, where every cobblestone tells a story of struggle and resilience. As you navigate this world, remember that the grandeur of the Enlightenment and the splendor of the aristocracy are just one side of the coin. Flip it over, and you'll see the grit and grime that fueled a revolution. Because when the world changes, it doesn't ask for permission. Keep your eyes open and your mind sharp, because this journey is far from over, and the next chapter of Parisian life promises to be even more tumultuous than the last. Stay tuned, because the revolution is just around the corner, and it's about to shake the very foundations of Paris and beyond. And so, as the sun dips below the Parisian skyline, casting its golden farewell over a city teetering on the precipice of change, you find yourself pondering the paradox that is 18th-century Paris, a city of beauty and decay where opulence rubs elbows with squalor, and the air is thick with the unspoken promise of revolution. You can almost hear the whispers of discontent threading through the cobblestone streets, like a haunting melody that refuses to fade. Let's talk about those political tensions simmering beneath the surface, shall we? Paris, in the late 1700, is a powder keg, and not just because of the occasional explosion of a poorly made firework. The monarchy, with its gilded halls and glittering chandeliers, is teetering on the brink of fiscal collapse. Louis Roman XVI, bless his royal heart, is trying to balance the books with all the grace of a unicyclist juggling flaming torches. His attempts at reform, like the hapless Edict of 1787, are met with the kind of resistance usually reserved for a dentist visit. The nobility and clergy, those tax-exempt pillars of the ancient regime, are about as helpful as a chocolate teapot, blocking any move that threatens their privilege. Enter the Estates General, the political institution that's supposed to give everyone a say, but functions about as efficiently as a one-legged man in a butt-kicking contest. The Third Estate, everyone who isn't a noble or clergy member, has had it up to here with their lack of representation. Picture this, 97% of the population getting outvoted by the privileged 3%. If that sounds like a recipe for disaster, congratulations, you've just unlocked the secret to the French Revolution. As the day winds down, you can almost hear the ghosts of revolutions past whispering through the streets, urging the common folk to take up arms in pursuit of liberty, equality, fraternity. It's a call to action that resonates deeply, even if the reality is more let them eat cake than we the people. Speaking of which, let's debunk that juicy little tidbit about Marie Antoinette. The poor woman probably never uttered those infamous words, yet they've come to symbolize the monarchy's obliviousness to the plight of ordinary Parisians. Ah, history, always ready to trade nuance for a catchy soundbite. But back to our evening stroll through Paris, where the romantic allure of the city is undeniable, even as the stark realities loom large. The twinkling lights of the city offer a soft focus that blurs the edges of hardship, casting everything in a warm, forgiving glow. It's easy to get swept away by the romance of it all, the Seine shimmering under moonlight, the silhouette of Notre Dame against the star-studded sky. But beneath this picturesque facade lies a different story, one of struggle and survival, where the cost of living is a daily battle and the promise of a better tomorrow feels as elusive as a perfect soufflé. So, how does this all compare to today? Well, for starters, we can all thank our lucky stars for modern plumbing. The thought of emptying chamber parts out the window is enough to make anyone grateful for indoor toilets. And let's not forget the joys of democracy, a system that's far from perfect, but at least tries to give everyone a voice, rather than just the powdered and privileged. The Enlightenment may have sparked the idea of equality, but it's taken centuries to even begin to live up to its ideals. As we wrap up our day in 18th century Paris, let's take a moment to appreciate the legacy that this tumultuous time left behind. The French Revolution, fueled by the very tensions simmering beneath these cobblestone streets, would go on to reshape not just France, but the entire world. It was a bold experiment in human rights and governance, proving that change is possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. And yet, while the revolution promised liberty and equality, it also unleashed a torrent of violence and chaos that would engulf the nation for years to come. It's a reminder that progress often comes with a price, a sobering thought as we enjoy the freedoms and conveniences of the modern world. The streets of Paris may no longer run with blood, but the echoes of those revolutionary cries still linger, urging us to remain vigilant, to hold onto our hard-won rights with both hands. So, there you have it, a day in the life of 18th century Paris, a city caught between the past and the future, where every shadow hides a story and every corner holds a secret. It's a place that challenges us to look beyond the romance and see the reality, to recognize the struggles that paved the way for the world we know today. As you close this chapter, remember that history is not just a collection of dates and names. It's a living, breathing narrative that shapes our present and guides our future. Stay curious, stay questioning, and never forget that the past is always closer than you think. Careful where you step, you might just trip over a philosopher. Welcome to Alexandria in the late 4th century, a bustling intellectual playground where ideas were exchanged as freely as fish at the market. This city wasn't just a melting pot. It was more like a pressure cooker of cultures, each adding its own spice to the stew. Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, Jews, all crammed together in a city that was the envy of the ancient world. And right at the heart of this whirlwind of wisdom and wackiness was Hypatia, a woman who was so ahead of her time that she needed a calendar just to keep track of it. Born around 360 CE, Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, a mathematician and philosopher who doubled as the ancient equivalent of a helicopter parent. Theon was determined to make his daughter the intellectual superstar of Alexandria, which, by the way, was no small feat. It's like training your kid to be the world's best juggler in a circus full of jugglers. But Theon knew his algebra from his elbow, and Hypatia turned out to be a prodigy. She was educated at the Mausian, the ancient world's answer to a research institute, complete with libraries and lecture halls. Think of it as the Ivy League of the Mediterranean, except with more scrolls and fewer frat parties. Hypatia's education covered everything from mathematics to philosophy, and she likely took part in discussions that would make a TED talk look like a game of charades. We're talking about a time when Euclid's Elements wasn't just a dusty book on a shelf. It was the very foundation of geometric knowledge. Hypatia not only studied these works, but also expanded on them, and some even suggest she improved on her father's commentaries. She was a mathematical mastermind in a toga, proving that not all heroes wear capes. Some wear tunics and sandals. And let's talk about her wardrobe for a hot second. Hypatia famously wore the philosopher's cloak, a garment that might look like a bedsheet to us, but was actually the ancient world's version of a power suit. It was a statement piece that screamed, "I'm here to school you in logic and reason," and it probably had a pocket for a stylus and some papyrus, because practicality never goes out of style. Ancient dress codes were as peculiar as they were precise. For instance, the Romans had a law against wearing purple unless you were the emperor. It was basically a fashion police state. But Hypatia didn't care much for sartorial restrictions. She was too busy calculating the circumference of the earth. Now, you might be wondering how a woman in the 4th century managed to become such a towering intellect in a world dominated by men. Good question. The answer is a mix of her father's support, her prodigious talent, and the relatively progressive attitude of Alexandria, where women had slightly more leeway to pursue academic interests compared to the rest of the Roman world. But don't get too starry-eyed about ancient feminism. Women were still mostly expected to stick to the 3 Cs, cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing. Hypatia was the exception, not the rule, and she had to be twice as brilliant to be considered half as good. It's crucial to note that Alexandria during Hypatia's time was not just a feast of the mind. It was also a political minefield. The city was part of the Roman Empire, but it was a powder keg of religious tensions, with pagans, Christians, and Jews each vying for influence. This simmering cauldron of faiths often boiled over into violence, and Hypatia, being a prominent pagan philosopher, was right in the thick of it. Her life was a high-wire act, balancing intellectual pursuits with the ever-present threat of political unrest. It was a bit like trying to do long division while someone's tossing lit torches your way. Interestingly, Hypatia's fame as a scholar wasn't just local. She attracted students from all over the empire, making her home a sort of ancient heirloom for aspiring philosophers. These young minds came to soak up her teachings on Neoplatonism, a school of thought that was all about connecting the human soul to a higher spiritual realm. It sounds deep because it is. This was no light reading. Hypatia could make your brain hurt in the best possible way, offering insights that were as profound as they were perplexing. But let's not get too carried away with the nobility of ancient academia. The truth is, academia back then was as much about networking as it was about knowledge. Hypatia's lectures were a mix of intellectual rigor and social maneuvering, a delicate dance that required more than just a sharp mind. She had to navigate a society where philosophy was often seen as a threat by those in power, and where being too smart could be hazardous to your health. It was a world where ideas could be as dangerous as swords, and Hypatia wielded them with unparalleled skill. In the end, Hypatia's early life and education were a testament to her brilliance and resilience. She rose to prominence not by conforming to the expectations of her time, but by shattering them. The intellectual legacy she left behind was as rich and complex as the city she called home. Her story is a reminder that even in times of turmoil, the pursuit of knowledge can be a beacon of hope and a catalyst for change. As we dig deeper into her life in the coming parts, just remember, behind every great mathematician, there's a father at home fretting about whether she's memorized the multiplication tables. Now, let's dive into Hypatia's mathematical prowess, which was about as subtle as a philosopher in a toga at a toga party. We're talking serious brainpower here. Picture her as the ancient world's version of a computer, only without the blue screen of death. Just pure, unadulterated genius. One of her most notable contributions was her commentary on Diophantus's Arithmetica. If you're not familiar with Diophantus, think of him as the great-grandfather of algebra, which means he was to mathematics what Bayan say is to pop music, a total game changer. Hypatia didn't just read Diophantus. She dissected his work like a surgeon with a scalpel. Her commentaries were so insightful that they helped future mathematicians, like the Persian scholar Al-Khwarizmi, who, by the way, gave us the term algorithm. See, Hypatia's influence is like ancient mathematics' version of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. But she didn't stop there. Hypatia also tackled the work of Ptolemy, the ancient astronomer who turned the universe into a geocentric snow globe, with Earth right at the center. Although Ptolemy's model was as flawed as a politician's promise, it dominated scientific thought for over a millennium. Hypatia's commentaries on Ptolemy's Almagest were rigorous, demonstrating not just her mathematical chops, but also her astronomical insights. It was like she was saying, "Hey, Ptolemy, nice try, but let's refine this a bit, shall we?" Now, onto some myth-busting. There's a popular legend that Hypatia invented the astrolabe and the hydrometer, as much as we love the idea of her being the MacGyver of the ancient world, fashioning tools out of papyrus and sheer brilliance. These claims don't hold much water. The astrolabe was around before her time, and while she might have improved on existing designs, calling her the inventor is a bit like crediting Steve Jobs for inventing the smartphone. Still, the romantic image of a woman inventing such devices in a man's world is hard to resist, even if it is a historical embellishment. Speaking of embellishments, let's tackle that whole pagan label. Hypatia was indeed a pagan, a term as broad as calling someone a music lover. In her time, paganism was simply the old-school religion of Rome, involving a pantheon of gods who were as dysfunctional as a reality TV family. But labeling Hypatia as merely a pagan philosopher oversimplifies her intellectual legacy. She was a Neoplatonist, a philosophical school that made Plato's ideals the heart of intellectual life. This wasn't just about worshipping Zeus. It was about seeking truth and understanding the universe through logic and reason. Basically, Hypatia was more about the philosophy than the pantheon. Now, here's the kicker. Being a female scholar in a male-dominated field was about as easy as riding a unicycle on a tightrope while juggling flaming torches. Alexandria might have been more progressive than a toga party, but let's not kid ourselves. Hypatia faced significant barriers. Economics played a huge role in her ability to study. Her father's status and wealth afforded her an education that was out of reach for most women. In the ancient world, knowledge wasn't just power, it was a luxury. A scroll wasn't something you picked up at the corner store. It was a prized possession, costing as much as a small fortune. Hypatia's financial backing allowed her to amass a library of texts and attract students who could afford the tuition of knowledge. In many ways, her home was an intellectual salon of sorts, where ideas flowed more freely than wine at a bacchanalia. But let's not sugarcoat it. Hypatia's success was the exception, not the rule. The average woman in the Roman Empire was more likely to be found in the kitchen than in a classroom. Despite these challenges, Hypatia thrived. Her lectures were legendary, drawing students from all over the empire. Imagine being so influential that people would travel hundreds of miles on the ancient equivalent of an Uber, a donkey, or a ship, just to hear you speak. And her students weren't just there for the intellectual stimulation. Being associated with Hypatia was a status symbol, a bit like name-dropping a celebrity today. However, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Hypatia's prominence made her a target in the volatile political climate of Alexandria. The city was a hotbed of religious tension, and Hypatia, with her pagan roots and philosophical teachings, was caught in the crossfire. It was a time when ideas could be as dangerous as weapons, and Hypatia's intellectual independence was seen as a threat by those in power. Being a woman didn't help. Let's face it, society often has a way of punishing women for being too clever. If Hypatia were around today, she'd probably have a viral TED talk while simultaneously dodging Twitter trolls. Hypatia's story reminds us that while some things have changed, like women having the right to education and the luxury of debating philosophy without fearing for their lives, other challenges remain eerily familiar. Her life was a testament to the power of intellect and the courage it takes to defy societal norms. As we continue to explore her contributions and the impact of her work, let's remember that Hypatia's legacy is not just about her mathematical achievements. It's about her relentless pursuit of knowledge in a world that wasn't quite ready to accept a woman leading the intellectual charge. In the next parts of our journey, we'll delve deeper into the political turmoil that ultimately consumed Alexandria and Hypatia's role within it. For now, let's just say that her life was a masterclass in balancing brilliance with bravery, and her story is far from over. Keep those thinking caps on, because this ancient narrative is just warming up. As we plunge headfirst into Alexandria's political tempest, prepare to witness Hypatia juggling intellect and influence like a masterful circus act, all while sidestepping the proverbial banana peels of early Christian politics. At the heart of this swirling maelstrom were two heavyweights, Orsts, the Roman prefect, and Cyril, the ambitious bishop. Think of them as the original odd couple, only with more religious zeal and far fewer sitcom antics. Orsts, the bureaucrat in charge, was the guy tasked with keeping Alexandria from descending into chaos, a job about as easy as herding cats in an earthquake. With a background in public service and a keen sense for the city's undercurrents, Orsts wasn't just playing political chess. He was trying to keep the board from flipping over entirely. On the other side of this political tug-of-war was Cyril. Picture a man who viewed every disagreement as a personal affront, and you've got a fair idea of Cyril's disposition. He was a man on a mission to expand the influence of Christianity, sometimes with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Now, insert Hypatia into this dynamic duo's drama. Was the intellectual powerhouse whose salon was a haven for free thinkers, including Christians, pagans, and anyone with a penchant for Neoplatonism. Her friendship with Orsts was the stuff of legends, or, if you prefer, the stuff of gossip columns. She was advising him on matters both political and philosophical, and let's face it, having the smartest person in the room on your team is never a bad strategy. But this relationship put Hypatia in the crosshairs of Cyril, who saw her as an obstacle to his ecclesiastical ambitions. Cyril's disdain for Hypatia wasn't just about her pagan beliefs, it was about power and influence. Hypatia was like a walking, talking think tank, and her influence over Orsts irked Cyril to no end. In today's terms, think of her as the influencer who could sway public opinion with a single scroll. The city of Alexandria was more than just a battleground for political ideologies. It was a pressure cooker of religious tensions. Christians were gaining momentum and power, but they were not without opposition. The pagans, though dwindling in number, still held significant sway over the city's intellectual and cultural life. Hypatia, as a prominent pagan philosopher, was seen by some as the last bastion of this old order. The tension between Orsts and Cyril reached a crescendo in 415 CE, when a dispute over church influence turned bloody. Christians in Alexandria, led by Cyril's faction, were not above using force to achieve their aims. And when Orsts publicly punished a Christian for inciting violence, Cyril's supporters saw red, figuratively and literally. Cyril's monks, known for their zeal and lack of restraint, were as subtle as a brick through a stained glass window. They attacked Orsts, highlighting the volatility of the period. Hypatia, caught in the middle of this religious and political whirlwind, continued to teach and advise. Her home remained a sanctuary for those seeking knowledge, a beacon of reason in an increasingly irrational world. However, her close association with Orsts made her a target for Cyril's faction. In a world where political rivalries were as cutthroat as a Game of Thrones episode, Hypatia's intellectual independence was a double-edged sword. It made her influential, yes, but also dangerously exposed. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the myth of Hypatia's downfall. Many stories paint her as a martyr for science and reason, a tragic victim of religious fanaticism. While there's a grain of truth here, the reality is far more complex. Hypatia was not simply a casualty of a pagan versus Christian narrative. Her death was the result of a toxic mix of political power struggles, religious fervor, and societal upheaval. It's like blaming the fall of Rome solely on bad plumbing. It misses the bigger picture. This isn't to say her story isn't compelling. The image of a lone woman standing against the tide of religious change is undeniably romantic, but it's important to remember that Hypatia was a product of her time, a time when politics and religion were as entwined as a pair of star-crossed lovers. Her influence, while significant, was ultimately overshadowed by the inexorable rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Hypatia's tragic end was a sobering reminder of the dangers that come with challenging the status quo. She was brutally murdered by a mob of Christian zealots in 415 CE, her death a chilling testament to the volatility of the era. It wasn't just her paganism that sealed her fate. It was her audacity to believe in a world governed by reason and logic, a world where ideas could flourish without fear of persecution. And yet, despite the horror of her demise, Hypatia's legacy endured. Her contributions to mathematics and philosophy laid the groundwork for future scholars, proving that while you can silence a voice, you cannot erase an idea. In the grand tapestry of history, Hypatia's story is a stark reminder of the human capacity for both brilliance and brutality. Her life was a masterclass in navigating the murky waters of power and influence, a testament to the eternal struggle between progress and tradition. As we continue to unravel her story, let's not forget that Hypatia's legacy is as much about her intellectual achievements as it is about her courage to defy societal norms. Her tale isn't over yet. There's still plenty more to explore in the annals of ancient Alexandria. So keep your mental engines running, because the next chapter in this epic saga is just around the corner. So here we are, staring down the barrel of one of history's most tragic, moments, the brutal murder of Hypatia in 415 AD. This isn't your run-of-the-mill assassination. It's more like the grim climax of a Shakespearean drama, complete with power-hungry bishops, misguided zealots, and a city where rumor was as potent as the scalding desert sun. Hypatia's demise wasn't just a random act of violence. It was the unfortunate crescendo of a symphony composed of political discord, religious fervor, and human folly. The rumor mill in Alexandria was working overtime, churning out tales that painted Hypatia as a sorceress and a pagan puppet master, pulling the strings of Orsts, the Roman prefect. In reality, her greatest crime was being a woman who dared to think, teach, and influence in a world where such attributes were considered as dangerous as a lit match in a fireworks factory. Now, let's unpack this sinister stew. Cyril, the bishop with ambitions as grand as his rhetoric, had his own propaganda machine. His followers weren't just any group of enthusiastic churchgoers. They were more like a medieval PR firm, spinning tales faster than a spider on caffeine. They painted Hypatia as the ultimate villain, a symbol of the pagan resistance against the rising tide of Christianity. In truth, she was simply an intellectual beacon, a symbol of what the old order had to offer: knowledge, reason, and debate. The mob that ultimately took Hypatia's life was fueled by more than just religious zeal. They were high on the intoxicating brew of power and hysteria. Picture a crowd whipped into a frenzy, convinced that eliminating Hypatia would somehow purify the city. It's the same tragic groupthink that has fueled countless other historical atrocities. Mob mentality is a fickle beast, thriving on fear and misinformation, and once it's loose, it's about as easy to stop as a runaway chariot. Hypatia's murder wasn't a clean, surgical strike. It was a messy, brutal affair. Historical accounts, like those from Socrates, Scholasticus, and John of Nikiu, paint a picture that's more horror movie than historical documentary. She was dragged from her chariot, stripped, and brutally killed using shells and pottery shards, a method as brutal as it was symbolic. This wasn't just about silencing a voice. It was about making a statement. The irony: in trying to erase her influence, they immortalized her instead. Here's where we need to do some myth-busting. The romantic narrative often casts Hypatia as a martyr for science and reason, a lone beacon snuffed out by the dark forces of religious fanaticism. While it's a compelling story, it's a bit too neat and tidy for reality. Hypatia's death was less about a clash of civilizations and more about the volatile mix of politics and religion, a cocktail that's as lethal as it is potent. Hypatia wasn't just a victim of religious extremism. She was caught in the crossfire of a power struggle. In this high-stakes Game of Thrones, where the prize was control over Alexandria's soul, Hypatia was a pawn that became a queen. Her close ties with Orsts made her an indispensable ally, but also a glaring target. Cyril and his supporters viewed her as a threat to their burgeoning influence, and in a city where rhetoric could be as deadly as a sword, her intellect was a double-edged weapon. The economic context of Alexandria only added fuel to the fire. The city was a hub of trade, ideas, and wealth, a glittering jewel in the Roman Empire's crown. Control over such a city meant not just spiritual authority, but economic power. Hypatia, with her connections and influence, was a key player in this grand chess game. Her death was not just the silencing of a voice, but the removal of a powerful piece from the board. Cyril's role in Hypatia's murder remains a contentious topic. Was he directly responsible, or did he merely set the stage for the tragedy with his incendiary rhetoric? The historical jury is still out, but what's clear is that his followers acted with a fervor that suggests more than just religious devotion. They were driven by a mix of politics, power, and passion, a reminder that in the theater of history, the lines between hero and villain are often blurred. And let's not forget, Hypatia wasn't merely a relic of a bygone pagan era. She was a forward-thinking philosopher, an innovator who dared to think beyond her time. Her intellectual pursuits were a testament to the enduring power of knowledge, a light that even death couldn't extinguish. The tragedy of her murder lies not just in the act itself, but in the lost potential, the what could have been of her continued contributions to mathematics and philosophy. In the aftermath of her death, Alexandria was left to grapple with the consequences of its actions. Hypatia's murder was a watershed moment, a turning point that underscored the fragile balance between reason and fanaticism. Her story is a reminder that progress often comes at a cost, and that the fight for knowledge and truth is a battle that requires constant vigilance. As we approach the end of this chapter, let's not forget the lessons Hypatia's life and death have to offer. Her story is not just a cautionary tale of religious zealotry, but a beacon of intellectual courage. Hypatia's legacy is a testament to the enduring power of ideas, a reminder that while voices can be silenced, the truths they champion live on, echoing through the corridors of time. And with that, we have set the stage for the final act. Hypatia's story doesn't end with her death. It reverberates through the ages, influencing generations of thinkers and dreamers. In the next installment, we'll explore the aftermath of her murder, the impact on Alexandria, and how her legacy continues to inspire. So stay tuned, because this ancient tale has a few more twists and turns before we reach the final curtain. The echoes of Hypatia's death didn't just fade into the oblivion of history. They ricocheted through time, shaping the narratives of future generations and leaving an indelible mark on the tapestry of human thought. Her story, a blend of brilliance and brutality, has been retold, reshaped, and sometimes romanticized, morphing into a legend that both illuminates and distorts the realities of her life. But let's peel back the layers of myth and examine the enduring legacy of Alexandria's iconic philosopher. Fast forward a millennium or so, and we find ourselves in the Enlightenment, a period when the old world was suddenly obsessed with shining a light on all the dusty corners of human knowledge. This was the era when thinkers like Voltaire and Newton were shaking off the chains of medieval dogma and replacing them with the shiny new shackles of reason and science. It's no surprise that during this intellectual renaissance, Hypatia's story found a new audience. Her name became synonymous with the struggle for knowledge against ignorance, reason against superstition. She was the poster girl for the Enlightenment, a symbol of what could happen when ideas dared to challenge the status quo. During this time, thinkers began to mythologize her life, framing Hypatia as a martyr for science and a victim of religious fanaticism. Her tragic end was seen as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers that lurk when power and ignorance join forces. But, and here's the kicker, while this narrative is compelling, it's also a tad simplistic. Hypatia wasn't merely a one-dimensional martyr. She was a complex figure navigating a labyrinth of politics, philosophy, and social change. Her legacy is less about her death and more about her life's work, the mathematical and philosophical ideas that laid the groundwork for future generations. As we zoom into more recent times, Hypatia's story continued to captivate and inspire. In the 19th and 20th centuries, she became a symbol for various movements: feminism, secularism, and scientific inquiry. Writers like Charles Kingsley and historians such as Edward Gibbon took her tale and added their own flourishes, painting her as a beacon of wisdom extinguished by ignorance. But let's not get carried away with the romantic notions. The reality was that Hypatia's influence was felt most acutely in the realms of mathematics and philosophy, where her works continued to inspire scholars long after her death. And then there's modern pop culture, which has a habit of picking up historical figures and giving them a cinematic makeover. In films, novels, and even video games, Hypatia has been portrayed in myriad ways, from the wise philosopher to the tragic heroine. While these portrayals help keep her story alive, they often sacrifice historical accuracy for dramatic effect. It's like taking a classic painting and adding neon lights, not necessarily a bad thing, but it does change the original picture. Yet, despite the embellishments and distortions, Hypatia's story serves as a powerful reminder of the timeless struggle for knowledge and tolerance. Her life was a testament to the power of intellect and the courage it takes to challenge societal norms. She was a pioneer in a world that wasn't quite ready for her, a woman who dared to think differently in a society that preferred conformity. Her legacy is not just about her contributions to science and philosophy, but also about her indomitable spirit, the courage to stand for reason in an age of superstition. In reflecting on Hypatia's life, we're reminded of the cyclical nature of history. The battles she fought, between reason and fanaticism, knowledge and ignorance, are as relevant today as they were in the streets of ancient Alexandria. The story of Hypatia is not just a page from the past. It's a mirror reflecting timeless truths about the human condition. We may not face mobs with pottery shards, but the struggle for knowledge and tolerance continues in subtler, yet no less significant, forms. So, as we wrap up this journey through the life and legacy of Hypatia, let's carry forward the lessons her story imparts. In a world that often feels like a cacophony of competing ideologies, her life is a reminder of the power of reason and the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. Hypatia's tale is not just a historical curiosity. It's a clarion call for those who dare to seek truth and knowledge in a world that sometimes prefers the comfort of ignorance. Her legacy lives on, an enduring testament to the unyielding spirit of inquiry and the eternal quest for understanding. And there you have it, Hypatia, the philosopher, the mathematician, the icon. Her life may have ended in tragedy, but her story is far from over. It's a story that continues to inspire, to challenge, and to remind us that the pursuit of knowledge is a journey worth taking, no matter the cost. So, keep those thinking caps on, and let Hypatia's legacy be the guiding light in your own quest for truth,